Call the meeting back to order, and I'll take the chair's prerogative and ask a few questions to our guest, Secretary Buttigieg. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being here. It's great to see you again, my fellow recovering mayor there. Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport received a build grant for its Northside Rail expansion project to allow the airport to meet its growing needs. However, as you know, a series of challenges stemming from various departmental requirements have hindered progress, and as a result, the airport is seeking to scale the project to focus solely on the 24th Street overpass. Because the obligation date for the grant is rapidly approaching, the airport is at high risk of losing these critical federal funds. Mr. Secretary, this project is important to the city of Phoenix and to Sky Harbor's future growth. Will your department support our efforts to extend the period of eligibility for the grant and work with the airport on this modified project so it does not lose these critical federal funds?
So our goal, of course, is for every grant recipient to succeed when funds are awarded. In this case, it was 2019 funding. I believe the issue here had to do with meeting the obligation deadline with the proposed change in scope that they had. But we'd be happy to follow up and engage your staff to explore anything we can do to be supportive in the context.
We really appreciate working closely with you to make sure we retain those critically important federal funds. Arizona is one of the fastest growing states in the nation, and we have real transportation needs. To meet these demands of our growing population, we must invest in our interstate highways. Interstate 10 is a key corridor connecting Phoenix and Tucson, yet there is still a large section that is only 2 lanes, creating traffic bottlenecks for the more than 110,000 vehicles per day that utilize it. And we need new highways to move commerce and people, like Interstate 11, to link the last 2 metropolitan areas in the country, Phoenix and Las Vegas, that are not connected by an interstate. Arizona has committed resources to the next phase for the environmental work for Interstate 11 and is investing $400 million in Interstate 10 to expand capacity to address safety concerns, improving the movement of goods and people, and to increase access to the Gila River Indian community. But Arizona cannot meet these growing needs on its own. It does need a strong federal partner. Mr. Secretary, do you agree that the mega grant program should focus on projects of this size and scope, like the expansion of I-10 and construction of I-11, that cannot be done by the state alone with its annual formula dollars, to ensure the federal government is a full partner on these projects that have impacts on regional and national mobility and commerce?
Thank you. Certainly the intent of the MEGA program and our goal in administering it is to make sure that projects that are too large or too complex in their scope to be supported through traditional means, very much too large to be shouldered by a state alone, get the federal support to help see them through. And so while taking care, of course, not to prematurely comment on any application, I would certainly say that we intend to be supportive of as many qualifying projects as we can, knowing that the scales that you see with some of these efforts are exactly why it was necessary to have an additional source of funding as provided in IIJA over and above what we've had to work with in the past.
All right, Mr. Secretary, I want to talk about one final issue, and that is passenger rail service. Phoenix is the largest city in the United States without access to passenger rail service. As other communities have gained access to passenger rail, they've experienced significant new economic opportunity. But my state, unfortunately, has missed out. I'm hopeful that will change, and there is reason for optimism. Amtrak has proposed connecting Arizona's 2 large and fast-growing metropolitan areas, Phoenix and Tucson, with frequent and reliable passenger rail service. Mr. Secretary, in your opinion, what can we do to best support the Tucson-Phoenix West Valley rail line?
Well, the framework that I think will allow us to support efforts like this is the fact that the overall funding for passenger rail includes a set of funds that is specifically for looking beyond the Northeast Corridor. Of course, a lot of the attention is on the Northeast Corridor, but a lot of the need is elsewhere. So the FRA has issued a framework for a corridor identification and development program. This came out in May, and the first project pipeline should be issued within a year, so next May. And that's one of the places I think would be natural to look in the context of the federal-state partnership that got extraordinarily enhanced funding through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of had the pleasure of arriving by train in Flagstaff, and certainly understand why there's a need and appetite for that kind of service further south.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. My time is completed, so now the next up will be Congressman Babin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Graves. I want to thank you for your time today, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, despite the administration's best efforts, oil and gas don't seem to be going anywhere but higher. So if you really wanted to help Americans move our transportation goods, I would think that you might want to consider right now as working with the president to combat high gas prices. That's number one. And doing something doesn't mean blaming President Putin of Russia or begging the Saudi crown prince for relief or calling the oil and gas companies of America evil and stifling their production. However, instead of calling on the president, who is your boss, to do everything in his power to address skyrocketing gas prices, I've heard you prioritize the use of taxpayer dollars to push a message of social justice, fighting racist highways and equity in transportation. And I'm struggling to square your priorities with economic reality that we're facing in the United States today. You say communities of color are oppressed by racist roads, and while at the same time, you're ignoring the fact that these same people are being disproportionately oppressed by rising gas prices. In fact, it's fair to say this administration is directly burdening low-income families since they're taking the brunt of massive economic challenges that we're facing today. And Mr. Secretary, you've recommended that Americans who cannot afford a $6 gallon of gas should buy an electric vehicle. And I'm going by the Kelley Blue Book of $55,000, but even at your statement a while ago at $39,000, I'm not sure how you can justify making that ask to folks who can barely provide for their families, especially Black and Hispanic households bringing in an average of $45,000 and $55,000 respectively per year. How on earth would they be able to buy a car that costs almost as much as they make in 1 year? And I really think that if you want to do something, I think we need somebody who is serving as secretary that would be laser focused on supporting transportation capabilities and not pushing social agendas in this country from your position. We have serious issues going on in the United States. Flight cancellations, worker shortages, sky-high fuel prices, unprecedented supply chain challenges. But unfortunately, I see more headlines about your positions and stances on abortion and on your thoughts on gun rights than I do on plans to improve our transportation and our infrastructure. I think Americans want lower gas prices and policies that will end this inflation and this economic hardship that we have today, not a woke social agenda such as a $1 billion pilot program that you launched last month to combat, quote, combat racially disconnected roads. That's $1 billion, and that's $1 billion right out of the taxpayers' money. And I think Americans know that your administration, that the Biden administration, have mismanaged much of our natural resources, our economic activities, and sound policies, which has caused this inflation and pushed us to the verge of a recession, which we are teetering on right now. It certainly appears to be a dereliction of duty on the part of many in this administration to favor foreign nations over our own. Frankly, I don't think the price of gas is an accident. I believe that it's part of an agenda designed to fundamentally change the way our energy and transportation sectors work together. And unfortunately, that is an agenda that leaves American superiority in the dust. And it's an agenda that empowers China and Russia and the Middle East. And Mr. Secretary, I do have a few questions that I'd like to submit for the record because we're just about out of time. And I look forward to your department's response. I want to thank you again for being here. I appreciate that. And I think that the American people deserve a lot better than what we're getting right now with our economy. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. I was going to give the Secretary maybe a minute to respond if you'd like to.
Sure. I just want to address a factual inaccuracy in your question that I think is important. You began by saying that gas prices have only gone up. You'll be relieved to hear that they have gone down every single day for the last several weeks. And I believe that's connected to the aggressive actions that the president has taken to reduce gas prices for Americans. Of course, we want that price to go lower. It needs to. We're all feeling the effects at the pump. That's why we don't agree with the idea that it's okay to let Putin off the hook for his activities, or to let oil and gas executives off the hook for their stated intention of not increasing production at a time of extraordinary profits. I have never suggested that it would be easy for all Americans to afford electric vehicles, although again, I would point to the fact that the first EV I ever had was about $14,000. But we think that policy measures can make it more affordable, and we hope that members in this body will reconsider their opposition to making EVs cheaper through tax credits.
Thank you very much. Next up will be Congressman Carson.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for participating today, also representing the great Hoosier State quite well. I'm curious, Mr. Secretary, I'm very proud to represent Beech Grove, Indiana, which is one of the most important rail maintenance facilities in the country. And unfortunately, there have been more reports of efforts to effectively downsize or outsource maintenance to improve the quality of passenger service. We need to improve Amtrak's national fleet, no doubt about it. I'm certain, and I'd love for the committee to hear your efforts, sir, to continue the support to strengthen the great work that's being done at Beech Grove and oppose any efforts to outsource this work. Are there particular updates or insights you can share, sir?
Well, for anything concerning the operational outlook for Amtrak, I would have to refer you to Amtrak leadership, but certainly recognize the importance of the work that workers at this facility do to keep our trains operating and operating safely, and would welcome any opportunity to work with your office on providing further information about how some of the funding coming toward Amtrak from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act can be applied in ways that will create a lot of work opportunity, as well as a lot of improvements for passengers, both in terms of the rolling stock and the maintenance, and then, of course, in terms of the day-to-day service.
Yes, sir. Also, we're looking forward to working with you on our targeted outreach for the bipartisan infrastructure bill, especially through our Congressional Black Caucus Transportation Brain Trust later in the fall. We want to make sure the historic investments you mentioned reach disadvantaged communities and minority businesses, and I know our staffs are working together on those details. Secondly and lastly, I'm very concerned about the worsening problems of blocked rail crossings, especially in places like downtown Indianapolis, where major intersections have been blocked for hours. This is a very serious safety concern that really impacts urban and rural areas. I believe there has to be more that needs to be done statutorily to address this issue. Mr. Secretary, do you agree those additional authorities could help alleviate the frequency of block crossings, and what more can our committee do to address this issue?
Thank you. We would welcome further opportunities to work on the issue of railroad crossings, both the effects that happen when they're blocked and the safety concerns that they present. I want to thank you for the support for the infrastructure law, which provides for the railroad crossing elimination program. We're hard at work getting those dollars ready, because we know that that's going to have a benefit, as you mentioned, both for rural and urban communities alike, where people have had that experience of being blocked or delayed by a crossing, but also, in addition, of course, to the economic and convenience effect, the simple safety dividend of having fewer such crossings. Highway railroad crossing incidents and trespassing have contributed to 900 deaths in fiscal year 2021 alone. And so we want to do everything that we can to prevent train vehicle collisions and to use the resources that we have to create fewer places where those conflicts can happen in the first place, and would certainly appreciate continued attention from Congress on this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I yield back, Chairman.
Next up will be Congressman Graves from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Good to see you again. Mr. Secretary, you and I have spoken in the past about strong concerns we have related to how the administration is prioritizing the allocation of grants. And you have large programs like infra and RAISE, nearly $1 billion each. I mentioned to you that I had actually written much of the amendment, had negotiated with other members the amendment that puts in law the right criteria for prioritization. So when the administration came out and said that racial equity, climate change, environmental justice, and enhancing union opportunities were going to be the driving factors, I had strong concerns because those are things that y'all are just deciding are priorities. They're not things that are actually in the law. And so then I said, okay, well, we'll wait and see how the grants are actually allocated and decide if this is a problem or not. Mr. Secretary, I remind you, I represent South Louisiana. We have one of the most at-risk states for sea rise. We have one of the highest African-American populations in the nation. We're at the bottom of the largest watershed, taking in runoff from Montana, New York, Canada, and everything that's in that water. And so I think if you go through and look at your criteria, we should be number 1, 2, and 3, really up there at the top. Yet, when you allocated funds under the infra program, I think it was 15% of the money. 15% went to the state of California. You had about $555 million went to blue states, only $350 million went to red states. Under the RAISE program, $162 million went to bike and pedestrian paths. So I want to ask you a question. If you look at TomTom, the navigation company's assessment of congestion, most congested areas in America, they said that New York was number 1. They said that Los Angeles was number 2. They said that Miami was number 3. Do you have any idea what number 4 was or is?
I don't.
So that would be the metropolis of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which puts it ahead of Chicago and San Francisco and a number of other significantly larger places. 62 hours a year, time lost just sitting in traffic. No one would have expected that be the case. So if you look at the 2 grant programs, $1 billion each, you would think that with us being the state that should be performing top under your criteria, top under the criteria that I wrote because I'm incredibly biased, yet we got 1 grant, and this is what it was: $18.5 million to improve fare collection for New Orleans Transit. It's kind of hard to understand, really hard to reconcile. I tried to get him to find a better snapshot on Google Map traffic, but it's normally dark red. This is the bridge. It's the only place in America where the interstate funnels down to a single lane. And it's not because we were innovative and came up with a great idea that nobody else could think of. It was idiotic, and proof is that we have 62 hours we sit around and waste in traffic. And here's the last slide. Is just a picture here showing the bridge that looks like a parking lot because people are just sitting there. This is I-10 connecting California to Florida. So I want to ask, how are you prioritizing, and how can projects like this not get funded when you're putting money toward bike trails, putting money toward, transit systems got $263 million under one of the programs, over a quarter of the funds, whenever we gave transit tens of billions of dollars during the COVID relief packages. The highways didn't get anything. So I guess I'm just trying to understand, what are we doing, and why aren't we putting money toward true national priorities that will relieve congestion, reduce emissions, improve time saved in traffic, and other things that I think we would share?
Well, our shared priorities, I think, are very well served by the things that we funded in the infra program and in the RAISE program. But I'll acknowledge that for every dollar we were able to give out, there were probably about 10 that applied. So we had a lot of worthy projects, many, I'm sure, from your district or your state and from all around the country, which qualified, but we were only able to work with the funding that we had. Of course, thanks to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we have more funding than before, which means we'll be able to say yes more often, and we love nothing more than saying yes to a good project or a good program. I think if we start ranking, how much is going to highways, we need to include the highway formula funds in that, right? Which is the bulk of the dollars that go to those purposes. And you have, of course, certain things like CMAQ that are, specifically by the very core of the program directed toward congestion mitigation. Although there's no reason why that can't be a benefit coming off something like a raise grant or another piece of legislation. I will say, one of the things we tried to do is really make sure that these dollars in infra, for example, got around the country regardless of, certainly regardless of politics. And one thing we were proud of is I think there was a 25% floor for rural projects. We did almost double that. We were in the 40s on supporting rural communities. I know that for every project we were able to say yes to, there's several more that would be, folks would be disappointed we couldn't get there.
right.
But again, thanks to this interview.
Secretary, I'm out of time, and I
Say
appreciate
yes
you
more
being
often.
here and answering the questions. I look forward to following up with you on this, and I would like to ask, Mr. Chairman, if it's okay, if you could please provide the committee with the metrics for how you have measured those 4 criteria that I mentioned, I would appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Next up is Congresswoman Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I want you to know that in Nevada, we share your enthusiasm for the funding that is going into infrastructure. I just point out a couple of things that we're doing. We got $2.5 billion for our roads and highways, $225 million to fix our falling down bridges, $100 million for our high-speed Nevada initiative for connecting with the internet, and $5.5 million for EV charging stations. That put a lot of people to work, or it will, and it's will help us to grow and develop. And we invite you to come out and see any of those projects in the works. We had the highest unemployment in the country at 35%, but we're recovering now at a rapid rate thanks to investments like this. So I hope we'll see you in Nevada. My question, though, I'd like to go back to my colleague from Phoenix to talk about intercity passenger rail. I want to just be sure I understand how that partnership grant program is going to work. So much of the investment in rail goes to the Northeast corridor, but we need to invest in the Southwest as well. They need improvement. We need greater availability. So I want to be sure that this would enable a public entity like Nevada to apply for the grant in partnership with a private intercity passenger rail company. Second, what's the timing for when that application will occur? And third, will you help us and work with me to see that regional impact as opposed to just local impact plays a role in the determination of who gets those grants?
Thank you. To take the last question first, we certainly want to think about the regional effect and how any given vision for expanding passenger rail fits into an overall vision for a first-rate passenger rail network serving the entire country. And I know there's a great deal of interest in this in the region you represent. I want to emphasize that under the annual funding of the partnership, the state-federal partnership, which gets $36 billion in advance appropriation over the next 5 years, that not more than $24 billion can be provided to projects that are in the Northeast corridor. So we understand and share the goal of Congress to make sure that no one region monopolizes the funding. Right now, FRA is working through the applications for the fiscal year 2021 partnership funding, but will later this year be able to make the funding available for the fiscal year 22. They issued just a few weeks ago in late June the notice of approach to developing the NEC inventory. But again, the non-NEC program will be made clear, the parameters of that will be made clear later on this year. And we certainly welcome the opportunity to work with you and work with project sponsors from your region on how to provide service where it could have a very big impact.
If you look at I-15 from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, on the weekend, it's like a parking lot going one direction or the other. We believe a speed train along that same corridor would carry people in both directions. It wouldn't just be a gambler's train. People would go south on the train to Los Angeles, could become a commuter train. It gets cars off the road and improves the air quality. it would just, we've been studying this for a long time and we're close to making some progress. So we hope to work with you and see that that happens. And I thank you very much. You can
Thank you.
come out there for the groundbreaking. How about that?
We'd love it. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Next up will be Mr. Lamalfa. Perfect time.
Hello, Mr. Secretary.
Afternoon.
Welcome to our little event here. Thank you. I'll launch right in here. So I'm a member from California, Northern California. And in my home state, we've had this project that was initiated in 2008 by a vote of the people for $9 billion worth of bond funds to go to the high-speed rail to complete a project from San Francisco to LA, right? So over the years, we've found that they fall farther and farther behind and the price goes up and up and up. It was sold to the voters then in '08 as a $33 billion project with the possibility of adding also a Sacramento and a San Diego spur for a little more money later. Well, it's fallen way behind. It was supposed to be completed in 2020, actually, was the original sale that the voters were given. And now they hope to have one segment done by 2023. And the price has skyrocketed from the $33 billion that the voters saw on the ballot to a number somewhere around $105 billion. And it was supposed to also draw in a lot of private investment to make up for the difference between the $9 billion and the 33 at the time. So they've been able to lay their hands on or identify a number somewhere around 20, 25 billion maybe for via cap and trade and other things for a $105 billion project. So we're $80 billion short of being able to build it out. And federal government has put forward recently, I think about $2 billion in the recent IIJA and about $3.5 billion in the 2009 Stimulus Act of 2009. And so here we find ourselves 80 billion short to build out at whatever today's price is of a project that currently, if they can complete it in a certain amount of years, who knows, would go from not SF to LA, but Madera to Shafter, California. Which Madera and Shafter are kind of like SF and LA, right? But anyway, I'm pretty tired of this project not meeting any promises and going way over and such. But I want you to be aware, Mr. Secretary, that a simple thing like the land acquisitions that are happening in the route, which they haven't identified the whole route yet. They know the easier part from through the valley and South Bay linking up with the North Valley. They don't know how they're going to get it through the Tehachapi's to LA. But they're not even paying people for the land that they've taken from them through eminent domain. Are you aware of that situation, sir?
You're saying that people have not been compensated for expropriation of their land?
Right.
I would want to see more details about the case here.
I'd be happy to supply that to you. So, I mean, can you support a federally backed project if it was more federal nexus of taking property without providing the compensation? You wouldn't do that, would you?
Well, any federally funded project would have to comply with all of the law with regard to obviously everything from Title VI to making sure people are appropriately accommodated. So again, I'd want to know more. Is this the subject of a federal complaint, to your knowledge? Anyway, we'll look into it.
We'll get back with you, yes, sir. Thank you. But as the prices go up, when does the value become not there for the thing? I mean, I can see Acela here on the East Coast, high ridership, density of population, that works out, more or less. But here, we're decades behind now by the time we build it out, and the price has at least tripled. Now, if I had a bid for getting my roof done, they told me $33,000, and they show up to start changing shingles, and they said, oh, now it's $105,000. I'd say, I need a different bid. So what is, at the end point, what's right for the taxpayers on this?
So the way we view it is that that decision is not entirely up to the federal government. It's largely up to the project sponsor and the people of California. As you noted, there's federal money into this, especially from the 2009-2010 funds. But also the state has, in its recent budget agreement, I think committed another 4.2. So what we really want to do is make sure that we're getting the greatest bang for our federal buck while partnering with the state and proceeding as they see fit.
They'll be looking to the feds for a lot more because we're about tapped out at the state level. Let me shift gears. I'm sorry. Time always goes fast. The AB5 implementation, that bill in California, which is basically taking small truckers and putting them out of business if they're not operating as an employee of a larger company. Have you provided any guidance to the truckers in the state about how we're going to apply with AB5 and not have just a complete loss of those pool of truckers and already the supply chain issues we have?
Well, certainly a priority for us is to increase employment in trucking, and we've seen that has grown substantially. So in this case, we've been able to engage with the different players, but I need to emphasize also that when it comes to the litigation that's going on over this, the department is not a party to that.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking owner-operators, not necessarily employees. The owner-operators, do they have a place at the table anymore?
Say again?
Do the owner-operators have a place at the table anymore, do you see?
We certainly think owner-operators are a very important part of the future of trucking, just as they are the present.
Okay, thank you. We have the PRO Act being had in D.C.
I think the time is...
AB5, but anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Next up will be Congressman Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary. It's great to see you. Welcome back to the committee. Let me just tell you how much I've been enjoying your testimony and your answers to questions. Like you, my starter EV was a C-Max, not much of a head turner, but very practical. I appreciate your sensibilities and also appreciate the calm and factual way you have debunked a few of the things that have been thrown at you by our colleagues, whether it's the price tag of EVs or conspiracy theories about government taking without compensation. We appreciate your leadership. One of the great things coming from a coastal California district that I believe is in the bipartisan infrastructure laws, the historic investments that allow communities to build greater resilience and adaptation. And of course, my district is on the front line of climate impacts. So this includes the $8.7 billion from the newly created Protect Grant Program, as well as new eligibility in the National Highway Performance Program to mitigate against sea level rise, projects that mitigate against sea level rise. So in my district, that's really important because it allows state and local transportation officials to plan and design and build differently. Instead of highway widening projects from the 1970s, it invites them to anticipate impacts we know are coming in the next 20 to 30 years. But it does require a change in approach, some institutional changes to shift away from doing things the way they've always been done. And I just wanted to ask you about that. Is the Department of Transportation helping to guide or plan with local and state transportation officials to make sure that they are looking decades down the road and not building projects from the 1970s? And I do realize that the chair asked you about whether you're forcing states and locals to build certain ways, and I appreciate your answer that you are not. But are you offering guidance and help for them to plan in the way we need them to plan?
Thank you for the question, and it's especially timely given what we're seeing in terms of climate impacts on American infrastructure. And we know when we are building something new that we might be making, or the project sponsor might be making a 30, 40, 50 plus year decision, which means that we've got to be prepared to build for the world as it will be, not the world as it has been. So for that reason, we are stepping up our efforts to collaborate with different project sponsors on being able to take those kinds of considerations that you raise into account. And I also want to stress our appreciation for the robust funding in the Protect program specifically dedicated to enhancing resilience. That's $7.3 billion over 5 years, and 1.4 of that in this fiscal year. That's out of the formula program plus a discretionary program too that we look forward to rolling out soon. All of which we think will help to put our money where our mouth is as a country on the idea of building resilient infrastructure and preparing for all of the impacts ahead.
Appreciate you mentioning the Protect program, and you said rolling out soon. Is there anything more you can tell us about the anticipated timeline for that?
Let's see, I brought my little table of upcoming notices of funding opportunity because I knew this would be of interest. I don't have a hard date, but I know that it's one of the priority programs we're looking forward to announcing shortly. And as soon as we do have a date, we'll make sure to make that known.
We look forward to hearing about that. In the time I have left, Mr. Secretary, I want to ask you about EV charging infrastructure, another important element of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And there have been some recent reports of Tesla opening up its supercharger network to non-Tesla EVs. They're already doing this. I guess they've been required to do this in the European Union. But I'm seeing some accounts of that change now coming here. Can you talk about whatever update you may have on that and how significant that would be to our aspiration of having ubiquitous, high quality EV charging infrastructure so we can accelerate this transition?
Well, it would make a big difference. We are working hard to reach the president's goal of 500,000 charging stations built out in a nationwide network by the end of this decade. And it's never been the vision that all of those are, or most of those, are government-owned and operated. Tesla has built an extraordinary, wide-ranging, and highly effective network of chargers that are available, of course, for use for the owners of those cars. I have heard Tesla leadership, including in meetings with me and other OEMs, discuss their vision for using some kind of adapter equipment to make them available to drivers of other vehicles. I haven't seen any concrete timelines or steps in that direction, but it's certainly something we would welcome.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Next up is Mr. Jimenez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to see you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, on September 6, 2019, in a campaign stop, the president in New Hampshire, he said, "I want you to look into my eyes. I guarantee you we're going to end fossil fuel." Do you support that?
Well, I certainly support a transition to domestic clean energy in our lifetime.
In your lifetime? Well, what's the time frame for that?
For my lifetime, only God knows the answer to that question, sir.
Okay, all right. What steps are you taking to, bring this along? What steps do you want to see the demise of fossil fuels here in the United States?
We want to see the rise of domestic clean energy production. It's creating a lot of jobs alongside fossil fuel industries, which of course are still a very important part of our economy. We recognize that we're running out of time when it comes to the consequences in terms of the destruction of American property and lives from the burning of fossil fuels in transportation applications and energy. We're pursuing a policy that's going to create more domestic clean energy production because we think that'll lead to a better economy and it'll save those lives and that property.
Even though the world, there's estimates that the world is going to need additional fossil fuels for the next 50, 60, 70 years, do you think that should be American fossil fuels, or that should be Saudi fossil fuel, or Venezuelan fossil fuel?
Our preference, again, is American-made, domestic, clean energy production, and that's
Well, you
what
keep
our
saying
policy
clean
is
energy.
moving towards.
Excuse me. You keep saying clean energy. I'm talking about fossil fuel. I'm talking about natural gas. I'm talking about gasoline, et cetera. Are you in favor of additional production here in the United States, or do you want to see that limited?
Well, as you know, we've proposed, for example, that oil companies that have decided not to produce right now be faced with a choice. They can either produce on the permits that they have, or they lose access to those. And that's an example of, I think, the administration's recognition that, at least in the short term, we are working with what we have, even as we're seeing a transition through.
On a different tack, I looked at the F-150 you said, both the electric and the gas-powered one, and there's a difference of about $20,000 between one and the other. And when you look at the $20,000, if you estimate about 20 miles a gallon, it's going to take about, at today's prices, it takes about 80,000 miles in order for you to break even. I'm not even talking about charging costs. I'm just talking, no charging costs. And so, if you actually put that down to about $2.50 a gallon, which was, the price of gas, before the Biden administration, that you don't break even until about 160,000 miles. Is the Biden administration actively pursuing high energy prices in order to force Americans into electric vehicles?
Of course not. And I also want to emphasize that you don't have to wait that 80,000 or 160,000 miles or however many it would be to break even if you don't pay for the vehicle in cash, right? The great thing about an auto loan is you can realize or lease, is you can realize the savings in terms of less maintenance and less fuel, even while the initial car payment might be higher, right? And so you're coming out ahead right out of the gate instead of having to wait many years for a payback, unless, of course, you are buying the vehicle in cash.
No, I mean, your finance costs are gonna be, depends if you lease it, et cetera, but the finance, at the end of the day, you're gonna be paying $20,000 more, however you cut it, at least. And actually, if you finance it, you're gonna pay it more because you're gonna be paying interest, all right? So at the end of the day, again, you're gonna take either 80 at $5 a gallon, it's 80,000 miles to break even. And then, by the way, have you figured in the 10-year lifespan of a battery that you have to change? So if you have 160.
Yes, we have. I mean, the estimates that are showing that this is reaching parity and pointing toward a savings, depending on the model, do account for things like that.
But you would agree that the higher the price of gas, then the faster you reach that parity.
Of course, the more pain we are all experiencing from the high price of gas, the more benefit there is for those who can access electric vehicles. It's why we're hoping you and your colleagues might reconsider opposing the reduction of EV upfront prices with tax credits.
So you're saying the more pain we have, the more benefit we're going to get.
Of course.
I think that's what I heard you say. I said the more pain that we
Really,
have.
that's what you heard me say?
That's what I heard you say.
I know you want me
The
to
pain
say
we
it so bad, but
Okay.
honestly, sir, what we're saying is that we could have no pain at all by making EVs cheaper for everybody, and we'd love to have your support on that.
EVs cheaper by subsidizing them, or?
Yes, that's part of it.
Yeah, but that doesn't make it cheaper. I mean,
Well, actually, it
somebody else
does.
is
So you have
paying
a,
for it.
you have a
We're all
market
paying for
making.
it at the end. We're
Right,
all
right,
paying taxes.
But it makes it cheaper because that market making investment gets you past the tipping point. Current estimates actually are that the U.S., as we cross that 5% new sales level, is starting to hit what analysts typically consider to be that tipping point. But the more we stimulate the production of the clean cars, right, the more you hit the economies of scale that makes them cheaper to produce in the first place, which means that you won't need as many subsidies in the future. That's why we believe in this policy.
Well, that's subject to debate. Thank you very much. My time's up. I yield back.
Thank you.
Congressman Payne?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary, thank you for being here today. It's always good to see you. A couple notes. The funding you mentioned going to Long Beach in reference to the rail expansion along the ships to remove the need for trucks. We might want to look at that for Port Newark as well. And so just, you know, I'm always throwing things at you, by the way. Also, in February, I led 34 other members in asking DOT to get nearly $7 billion out the door quickly to advance investments in the Northeast Corridor, the dreaded Northeast Corridor. Ooh. Under the department's current timeline for establishing the Northeast Corridor inventory, states and others are not likely to see this money until 2023. FRA's delay is unacceptable. What is your department doing to expedite the availability of these funds to answer our demand for better passenger rail?
So we recognize the importance of working swiftly to prepare these investments, while also making sure that these investments that you only get to do once are well considered. The Northeast Corridor Commission is working through the next steps, and we've been consulting with them. On June 25th, the FRA published a notice of approach to develop the NEC project inventory and opened up a comment period to get input from the stakeholders on the commission. And we want to continue that consultation with the commission, but that process is one, again, that happens not without a sense of urgency. And so we remain on track to publish the inventory by the statutory deadline, which is November 15th of this year.
Thank you. You know, on my taking over the chairmanship of Railroads, Pipelines, Hazardous Material, found at the FRA that there was no DBE program, and the Federal Railroad Administration has has studying if discrimination exists in the passenger rail industry. I can answer that, which would suggest the need for a disadvantaged business enterprise program. It's critical that the study is completed both thoroughly and promptly so that if a need is shown for the FRA DBE program, Congress can respond quickly to guarantee that the IIJA rail funding creates a fair playing field for disadvantaged businesses. When do you expect the disparity study to be completed? And do I have a commitment that this remains, as you told us last year, as a top priority for you?
Yes, it is very important to us to deliver on this priority, and we've undertaken a number of actions to move forward with this program and provide Congress with a package of material for consideration. I can tell you that the team is working hard to complete the study. It's a top topic every time I sit down with our FRA administrator, and as soon as it is fit for delivery, we will have it in your hands.
Thank you. Well, I think that's all I have, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Next up will be Mr. Mast.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Payne, you could have yielded me your time. I would have. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. I want to ask a very specific question, and this is about hours of service for truckers. Do you feel as though that you are endangering the lives of any American on the roadway with the hours of service waivers that are being given for truckers that are hauling something related to COVID or, Clorox or automobile parts?
Well, we think the waivers are justified, or we wouldn't enact them. I do think that over time, we're going to learn from the data that come back on what effect, looking back on these years, the waivers will have determined to have. But of course, if we didn't believe that they were a responsible way to strike the balance, we wouldn't pursue them.
Agreed with you, Secretary. If we didn't believe that they were responsible, they wouldn't be in place. So there are hours of service waiver for allowing truckers who carry food, fuel, products to fight COVID, livestock, car parts, a host of things on that list. And they can basically set their own flexible driving schedule that they otherwise wouldn't be allowed to, as long as they take a 10-hour break each day. So it's far more simple than what they otherwise fall under without that waiver. So I would say it in this way. I think you and I could agree that a trucker is not a safer driver because they're carrying Frosted Flakes that might be on the waiver list versus laundry detergent. That would be an agreeable statement?
I think so. Obviously, we recognize there are certain differences in cargo, but not all of those differences are the same as the ones that qualify you for the waiver. If that's
But in that example, Frosted Flakes would be waivered so that you could just, have a 10-hour break. Laundry detergent wouldn't be waivered.
Okay.
So that wouldn't make a difference in the quality of the trucker or how they perform their duties or safety?
I hope not.
I would hope not as well. Likewise, we couldn't say that they would be better because they're carrying Clorox wipes versus baby clothes, right? And the list could go on and on. So the request here is, for our truckers, the administration, it's clearly determined that this kind of flexibility for truckers, it's not a major safety threat to say truckers, hey, if you're carrying COVID-related items or Clorox wipes, all you need to do is make sure that you have a 10-hour break. We don't need all of these other things that go on in that hours of service, lack of flexibility. So it's not a threat. We agree on that. We've determined it. The goods being carried don't determine the threat largely. Obviously, there can be hazardous materials, but even when we talk about hazardous materials, we could say that fuel is on that waiver list, probably one of the most hazardous materials that could potentially be involved in a collision, but that is on the waiver list. So we look at this and we say the Trump administration, they had that policy for about 9 months. The Biden administration has now had that waiver policy for about a year and a half. So the request is, let's make it permanent and extend those protocols to truckers that are carrying anything. Right? They shouldn't have to go through the red tape of determining whether they're carrying Frosted Flakes or laundry detergent or Clorox wipes or baby clothes or whatever. If it's not a safety threat, as we've determined it's not, to give them those 10 hours, you get 10 hours of rest. It's not a safety threat. Let's let them not have to waiver this.
So I think the response to that hangs on the difference between believing something is a responsible balance and believing it has no safety impact at all. I think we're agreed that it was a responsible way to strike the balance, especially in responding to a crisis that's claimed the lives of 1 million Americans. I would want to see more data suggesting that there was no safety impact at all before I could endorse the conclusion that you're speaking to. But I do think, it is reasonable to say that any time, even if it arises out of an emergency, we gather data from some kind of flexibility being introduced, we should learn from that and include that in our decision-making for the future. I just wouldn't say that we've reached the point where we think that in any way justifies releasing those safety requirements wholesale.
Yeah, and I can appreciate you wanting to look at the finer data points of this. It would be wrong for us not to do that. But again, just to close that, we can see that we are assessing there's not a big enough safety threat to get rid of it. It's gone on for 9 months under Trump and a year and a half, plus 2 years under Biden. So it's not a big enough safety threat to not do that. We should be looking at that for everybody, given, people carry a host of different things. Just one final quick point here, and this comes from people that have to deal with the FAA badge office. I have an understanding that there are a number of very disrespectful people in the FAA badge office that people in D.C. here are not happy having to deal with in that office. If you could address that in the way that they treat people that come through that badge office, it would be greatly appreciated by some people that I know.
I'll look into that right away. Thanks for
Thank you
raising
very
that.
much. Appreciate it.
Chair recognizes Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, I represent the Port of Long Beach. I'm the co-chair with Randy Weber from Texas of the Congressional Caucus on Ports. Thank you for being here, and thank you for visiting our ports and really becoming so knowledgeable about our ports. I appreciate your efforts to ease port congestion and to reduce the costs for all American consumers. The IIJA Port Infrastructure Development Program, or the PIDP, is among the most critical tools to make freight move more efficiently, to strengthen our supply chains, and tackling the shipping costs. In addition to the legislation, measures like expanding gate hours at ports, pop-up container storage sites, ensuring more transparency and data for freight exchanges have been so important. And there are important signs of progress. For example, freight rates from China to the West Coast have fallen almost 50% in the last 2 months. I want to stress how critical it is that we ensure that the PIDP is allocated as quickly as possible, and that these funds support the electrification projects needed to increase efficiency and to reduce the environmental impacts which our higher freight flows have had on our climate and on our frontline communities. We also need to prioritize the funding available under Section 11402 of the IIJA to reduce truck idling at ports. Mr. Secretary, can you share more about what the administration is doing to prioritize these critical projects, to coordinate multimodal freight flows, and to reduce costs? And when can we expect funding to be awarded?
Thank you very much for the question and for the attention to the importance of efficiently and smoothly moving freight through our ports. As you mentioned, we've seen a lot of gains in terms of sharp reductions in the number of ships at anchor and in terms of improvements in shipping rates, although they are still, of course, higher than their pre-COVID levels, and we know there's more work to be done here. Specifically with regard to the Port Infrastructure Development Program, we're working to advance the 2022 funding as quickly as we can. We released the notice funding opportunity for that program within 90 days of the infrastructure law passing, consistent with the president's call to move quickly as part of the Ports Action Plan. We've also issued the amendment incorporating the funding from the Appropriations Act within 60 days of that legislation moving through. So now we've got the applications in, working diligently to review them and anticipate being able to announce awards early in the fall. And really look forward to the difference that can make in terms of our capacity and readiness at our ports. In the meantime, of course, we're not waiting for longer-term infrastructure upgrades in order to continue trying to drive progress in this regard. And I would point to measures like the creation of FLOW, Freight Logistics Optimization Works. This is a data-sharing platform. It's not mandatory. We're not ordering anybody to share anything. It's voluntary, but those different players, including private sector actors in different parts of the supply chain who contribute data, then get access to the benefits of participating in that system. We think it's going to make a big difference, and we're looking forward to having a prototype of that up later on this year. And our ports envoy, General Stephen Lyons, continues to work with all of the different players at the ports to spot and identify any and all issues that can be addressed in the near term, whether it's through federal action within our authorities or just getting the right players at the table.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Representative Johnson for 5 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, first off, I would thank you for the positive comments you've made about the Ocean Shipping Reform Act that Mr. Garamendi and I helped to usher through the House, and so thank you for your support of that. We've talked a lot about ports so far today, and I think that'll help. It's not a silver bullet, but I think it'll help. When you appeared before this committee last year, you and I had a productive conversation about siting and about how the same type of project that would take 2 years to get sited in highway project in France or in Germany, on average would take 7.5 years in America, which is clearly not evidence of American exceptionalism, and in fact makes it harder to have American exceptionalism present itself. You had talked then about some of the things that we can do. I think you said to move aspiration into action. Are we making any progress on that front, and do you see room for additional leadership by this Congress in helping make it easier for us to do large projects?
Well, first of all, let me acknowledge and thank you for your work on the Bipartisan Ocean Shipping Reform Act. It's another thing I should have mentioned just now in my earlier answer of something that we think will make progress on when it comes to shipping and supply chains. And to your question, yes, I think we've made progress, and yes, I agree. There's much more work to be done. The comparisons to Europe are especially important, I think, because we're talking about countries that are certainly rigorous in their labor standards and in their environmental standards, and yet consistently seem to be able to deliver projects at a lower cost and at a swifter timeline than tends to happen in the U.S. Some of the things we've done in this regard include increasing our visibility on what's going on with permitting. So the permitting dashboard is our main tool for doing that. And enacting the one federal decision related provisions that were in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that's included matching up the categorical exclusions that our department can join to with other agencies when there's some interagency question. And making sure that we have a game plan for how to hit those averages called for, the 2-year average, for the kinds of environmental review that many of our projects are subject to. But we recognize this is going to be a big ship to turn, and welcome all opportunities for good faith collaboration on how to do it without, of course, diminishing community voices or environmental or other important labor, other important policy considerations, but having a pace and a cost of getting through these processes that I think is what most Americans would expect.
Yeah, and one of the things I struggle with is, and this is true whether we're talking high voltage transmission lines or highways, people will talk about how long it takes to get something sited, and then I will tell them, okay, bring me the specific knob we can turn, right? And I'm sure you ask the same question. Because there are so many factors that slow down these processes, it can be hard to figure out what button do you push or what lever do you pull. So it's a bit of an unfair question for me to ask you, but as you review all of these myriad things that make it difficult to get big projects done in this country. Is there one piece that we should focus our collective fire on? One or two specific things we could be working together?
I think, as you noted, there's not a silver bullet here, but I do think there are a few directions that'll be productive to look in. One is the capacity of the project sponsor, so making sure that they have the tools they need to navigate these processes, especially because if we're successful in bringing investments to jurisdictions that haven't had much before, maybe small rural jurisdictions or low-income areas that just haven't done much with the federal process, we can't expect them on day one to know how to navigate it. So I think the support and the technical assistance there is going to be important. Second, of course, is to make the processes simpler in the first place. It's one of the reasons you see us combining some of our notices of funding opportunity and even combining the selection process, just to have less paper and fewer steps involved by virtue of having fewer programs on parallel tracks. I think visibility matters. That's why we think that the dashboard, I know it's a readout, not a mandate, but I actually think it could play an important role because it'll just help us spot some of these issues. We're trying to make sure we are combining the final EIS and the record of decision to make sure that there's not a big gap between those. We've also pursued the integration of some of the permitting processes with the NEPA side of it because we think some of those things can travel together too. So I'm afraid I don't have a sense of one or two things that would make all the difference, but anything and everything that we can do consistent with our bedrock commitments, we're certainly open to exploring.
Mr. Secretary, thanks. And then, Mr. Chairman, by way of closing, I would just note that this is a serious problem. I mean, nobody would suggest that European countries flout environmental or labor standards. They are able to get it done in 2 years. Frankly, America should be able to get these projects done in that kind of time frame as well, and I thank the Secretary for his efforts.
Thank you so much. The chair recognizes Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Secretary. Good to see you. Steve Lynch, I represent the Port of Boston, and thank you for your recent visit. It sounds like you've been getting around to all of our ports. That's a good thing. First of all, I want to thank you for the support of the Biden administration and your office. Recently, we received $62 million to try to rebuild the terminals in Logan Airport. Those are 1974-era terminals, so we really appreciate the opportunity to update those. I want to also thank your office for working with us on the North Jetty. We have obviously one of the oldest ports in the country, and some of our infrastructure dates back to pre-World War I. So we're trying to repair that, and your office has been very, very helpful. In addition, we've had some problems with the MBTA recently, and the Federal Transit Administration has been very, very helpful in terms of coming in with guidelines that allow us to operate that system, not at full capacity, but safely. And we appreciate their thoughtful and deliberate approach to that. One of the other positions I hold is I'm a vice chair of the Quiet Skies Caucus. And so we're having difficulty in and around Logan Airport. Logan Airport was actually originally built in the 1920s by the United States Army. And they laid out the runways to favor the wind direction for those planes back in the 1920s that didn't have much thrust. So unfortunately, as the city has grown, those runways now steer planes directly over many environmental justice communities. And not only that, but with the advent of next-gen RNAV systems, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of planes flying over laser-guided air vectors over the same homes repeatedly, and it's causing health problems for the people in those areas next to the airport. Now, I have tried to persuade the FAA to look at an approach here where they would adjust the configuration of the runways. We have an entire port area where they could be bringing in flights and having flights take off completely over water, not flying over these densely settled, as I say, environmental justice neighborhoods. But I have had great difficulty in persuading them to do so. I'm wondering if your your administration, your office would be willing to work with us on that. You know, we obviously have a great need in the area, but this is critical to the quality of life to the people in my district.
Well, I want to recognize your leadership of the Quiet Skies Caucus, and certainly we recognize that as the FAA moves to modernize the national airspace system, there is a risk that these efforts can result in changes to the flight pattern that effectively concentrate the route and concentrate the noise. And this, of course, concentrates the impact on the residents who live directly under them. I'd be humbled by attempting to venture anything specific to runway configuration. Here, I know that's very technical, often has to do with things like the direction of the wind and other engineering considerations, but certainly would welcome further dialogue with your office on how to make sure that those community impacts are managed as responsively as possible, and that any mitigations that can be identified responsibly are pursued. I know that the FAA has sought to add resources in terms of community engagement, and anytime that's found wanting, welcome the chance to work with the congressional office to try to firm that dialogue up.
That's great. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I just want to point out that periodically we do have to redo the runways. We just had one of the major runways redone over a year ago now, and we shut it down and we moved the flights to another runway. So logistically, we could do this if we had the. You know, I've had dealings with the FAA, and in some things they're great, and on other things they're impervious to public input and impervious to congressional persuasion as well. So I'd appreciate your cooperation on that, and I'm thankful for the work that you've done in the Port of Boston, and I appreciate what the Biden administration has done as well. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Balderson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary, thank you for being here. I was actually on the same flight to Columbus on Friday night with you, so it's good to see you going through the airport and getting on the plane, so thank you. I was a strong supporter of the Drive Safe Act, and I was proud to offer this bill as an amendment when the committee marked up Chairman DeFazio's infrastructure bill last year. This program creates a pathway for CDL holders between the ages of 18 to 20 to participate in interstate commerce after completing substantial safety training. And while I had major concerns with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, I was happy to see this important pilot program included in the final bill. Can you discuss the current status of the Drafe's Driver Apprentice Pilot Program?
Well, I want to recognize your work on this and recognize also that it happens in the broader context of needing to make sure that we have the strongest and best possible workforce in truck driving. It has been estimated that the gap is as high as 80,000, although I think it's closed to some extent. And so the question that this pilot program speaks to, of course, is there a way to engage younger drivers without any kind of detriment to safety? And I think the pilot program has provided us with a responsible way to determine that. In January of this year, FMCSA announced the establishment of the program in the Federal Register. So that was the first step, really, to get the details out about the pilot. And they're now completing some of the other administrative tasks they'll need just because it's a new program. But I do believe we will be able to begin to accept applications into this program by the end of summer of this year. And then we'll be watching closely, of course, to see how it unfolds and to ultimately gather the data that'll tell us what, if any, safety impact there is.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that answer. Mr. Secretary, last month I sent you a bipartisan letter signed by 67 of my colleagues regarding several issues facing motor fuel carriers and those transporting hazardous materials. One of these issues is the costly background check, redundancies within the Transportation Worker Identification Credential, hazardous waste endorsement, and the TSA pre-check programs. I've heard from drivers across industries that streamlining or harmonizing these credentials, which largely require the same information, would go a long way in reducing cost and unnecessary burdens on drivers. I understand this issue is under TSA's jurisdiction, but since you're the co-chair of the Supply Chain Disruption Task Force and you're the primary regulator of the trucking industry as Secretary of Transportation, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this matter or if you've heard anything from TSA or DHS on efforts to reduce these redundancies.
Well, I don't want to preempt the process of replying to your letter just because we do want to make sure we coordinate with DHS on that, given TSA's role. But let me affirm the general principle that whenever the government's gathering information from the same person twice, we have an opportunity. And provided we can find ways to meet this concern that don't have any adverse effect on safety and security, we're very open to examining what we can do.
Okay, thank you very much. And anytime you're in Columbus, Ohio, again, let me know. I'll get a nice dinner arrangement for you. So thank you, sir. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you so much. The chair recognizes Representative Carbajal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Buttigieg, welcome. I commend you and the Biden administration for your leadership in helping us to advance the historic bipartisan infrastructure law. This represents some of the largest investments to bring our nation's roads, bridges, transit, broadband, and waterways into the 21st century, and at the same time, create good-paying jobs for many Americans. My district has already begun to benefit from these federal infrastructure dollars in so many ways. Currently, the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments is working towards improving the U.S. Highway 101, which is one of two critical and major north-south arteries in California. This May, they apply for federal mega infra dollars to reduce congestion along the portion of the US 101, encourage a shift of mode of transportation, strengthen job accessibility, and reduce harmful pollution from greenhouse gas emissions. I worked on this project when I served in local government on the Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors. And I can tell you, this project is a win-win-win, not only for our local region, but for the entire state transportation system. There is $810 million, almost $1 billion, in state and local funds, yes, I said local funds, currently pledged to this project, which means approximately 80% of this project is coming from non-federal sources. So I think it's fair to say that it's time for the federal government to step up. Can you provide an update on the time frame for when your department will be making determinations on these applications?
Well, thank you for the question, and certainly we recognize that and the former mayor in me recognizes that state and local jurisdictions have been asked to shoulder too much for too long. It's part of why the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is so welcome. And part of what we've sought to do with the particular program you're referencing, the combined infra-mega rural NOFO, is to position ourselves to deploy these dollars as quickly as we can. When the deadline closed for this combined notice of funding opportunity, we had more than 450 applications. So we're working through those right now and should be able to announce selections in the fall. And looking forward to funding as many deserving applications as we can, and this will certainly get full and fair consideration.
Great, thank you. Again, 80% funded with non-federal dollars. As a member of the Climate Solutions Caucus, I supported the inclusion of the carbon reduction program in the bipartisan infrastructure law. How are you working towards reducing harmful carbon emissions?
Well, the carbon reduction program is going to give us $6.4 billion of resources to help communities and states and jurisdictions in this work. And we're looking forward to seeing the plans as they begin coming through on how states aim to use that. I should emphasize the bulk of this is formula dollars that the states can program as they see fit, provided it's consistent with the basic outlines of what Congress calls for in the legislation. Of course, that's not all there is to the opportunity to mitigate carbon through this infrastructure law. Just about anything you do in transit, almost by definition, will lead to reduced carbon pollution. That's doubly true for things like the low and no emission bus program and other things that help transit, which is already presumptively carbon reducing to also operate on a cleaner basis. And I think across all of the programming you see, even or especially when we're meeting other goals, like enhancing our supply chains or giving commuters or passengers a more convenient and efficient experience, that we're going to be making a major difference on carbon as well.
Thank you. Let me just close by reiterating my standing invitation to you to visit my district. As you can see, that 101 major project is a very significant effort going on in my region, but there's many others, and I hope you'll consider coming out. I know my constituents would love to showcase all that we've done and continue to do in regards to transportation and infrastructure. So please come out. Some of us call my area paradise on earth, which you would be remiss to not come out to. Thank you.
I'd love it. Thank you.
He does have a very nice district, I can, as chair, attest to that. We'll now recognize Mr. Katko for 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to correct the record and say that Syracuse, New York is paradise on earth, not Mr. Salud's district. But Mr. Buttigieg, I want to thank you very much for being here today, and it's good to see you again. The last time I saw you, I think we were in the White House a year ago in the Oval Office in February, speaking about infrastructure with a small group of individuals, with the president and vice president there as well. And lots happened since then, and I'm thrilled to say that I was the very first Republican to cast my vote in favor of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's a culmination of many years of work on my part and others. And it started back in 2017 with the Problem Solvers Caucus. I chaired the subcommittee that issued an infrastructure report. We updated it in 21. We presented it to a group of governors, senators, members of Congress, and it caught fire and went from there. So I'm thrilled that we finally got it across the finish line, and I'm glad to be able to talk to you about it here today. And Central New York, as you know, is going to be a major beneficiary of this act because of the Interstate 81 rebuild that's going to be going through the heart of the city. And that money is sorely needed there and elsewhere across this country. Providing stable and dependable federal funding for infrastructure was one of the reasons I came to Congress. And I was proud to do my part to make that a reality by supporting this infrastructure bill. In addition to providing billions of dollars for a wide range of other physical infrastructure priorities, New York State is seeing a significant increase in its apportionment of federal highway aid under this law, which is welcome news. From major highway projects to addressing wear and tear on rural roads, this funding makes a huge difference top to bottom across our state. And unfortunately, along with many of my constituents, I'm concerned about how far this money is going to go in the near future due to the dramatic rise in inflation. I want to note that the infrastructure bill is not the problem here, and it's not the inflation driver. There's not an expert who says it is. In fact, according to experts from the American Enterprise Institute, the infrastructure bill actually eases inflationary pressures in the long run because of its focus on improving productivity over the next decade. However, as we all know, this was not the only bill Congress passed last year, and we now find ourselves at a point where inflation reached a 40-year high of 9.1% last month, which is the most I've seen since I was a young man in the Carter administration, and the Carter administration was in power. Inflation has impacted prices in every sector, but of specific interest to our conversation today is the prices of construction materials and fuel, which are both through the roof. As states and localities try to budget for in-demand road and bridge projects, sustained inflation is going to make it even more difficult to stretch these critical infrastructure dollars to cover the projects that Congress intends them to. As a result, we end up facing the exact same dependability challenges this bill was supposed to address. So I have a couple of quick questions for you, and if you could help me with them, I'd appreciate it. First of all, what steps are the department taking to ensure that the purchasing power of the Infrastructure Act remains intact? And second of all, you can take these in either order you like. Can I assume that the Department of Transportation is focusing their efforts on permitting reforms to the Infrastructure Act to help reduce the baked-in costs and delays for these projects? And with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, and let me recognize your support and leadership when it came to this infrastructure law coming together, and strongly agree with you and with the economists who have indicated that seeing it through is going to ease inflationary pressure. For that reason, we feel a great sense of urgency about making sure that we effectively use these taxpayer dollars. And there's no question that the increased cost of input to building infrastructure represents a challenge for us in implementation. This is true whether we're talking about supply chain constraints contributing to raw material costs, or whether we're talking about workforce shortages impacting labor costs. So several things that we are able to do, and one thing I would point to is the collaboration that we have with project sponsors to share best practices from what we've seen around the country and even around the world on how to effectively keep those costs under control, use technical assistance to provide that kind of support, and of course continue working the root causes of the issue through efforts like the Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force. We also see certain flexibilities that do exist within the legislative framework, and when they are there, we will pursue them in order to make sure project sponsors succeed, but are of course always open to working with Congress on other measures that we can take to make sure that we really get that value, that $1.2 trillion worth of economic and other benefit to the American people for the taxpayer investment that's being made here.
Good, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you so much. I'll recognize myself now. Let me start, Mr. Secretary, setting a couple of things straight. I'm sure you'll agree with me that every American should have the freedom to buy whatever kind of car they want.
Agreed.
But when more people buy EVs, the overall demand for gas goes down, right? Which means that the price of gas also goes down for everybody who still exercises their choice to buy a gas guzzling car. So this is a win-win. I don't understand why this has become a partisan or tribal issue in America. And then when it comes to gas prices and Putin, I remember the days immediately after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Virtually all of my Republican colleagues were taking to the airwaves demanding that President Biden ban Russian oil. Every single speech on the House floor and committee hearings confronting administration officials coming to brief us, and all of us knew perfectly well that this would result in gas prices going up. You cannot take the #2 world's exporter of oil offline in a day without having that effect. And in those days, I drafted a House resolution that would have urged President Biden to do exactly that, to ban Russian oil, but in the text, acknowledging that there would be economic sacrifices for the American people, hoping that we could come together as Democrats and Republicans patriotically urging the president to do the right thing, but taking common responsibility. And I couldn't find a single Republican to sign on to that resolution because apparently some people wanted the president to do it and then to blame him for the consequences. And unfortunately, we're still seeing that today. With that, I want to ask you about what I always ask you about, which is the Gateway program for New Jersey and New York. We've made such extraordinary progress working with you and your team. We ended the Trump-era policy that made it harder for states to finance their portion of big infrastructure projects. We finally got the environmental impact statement done for the tunnel. We secured an improved project rating from the Federal Transit Administration. We signed a full funding grant agreement to replace the Portal North Bridge, and we'll be breaking ground on that essential project in the coming days. And just 2 weeks ago, New Jersey and New York agreed on how they're going to split the costs of this incredibly important project at the state level. And then, of course, we passed the infrastructure bill that will fund this. But just as I pushed really hard to get us to this point, I'm going to push just as hard to get this done faster. And I understand these projects are complicated. They don't get built overnight, but I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear my constituents are not going to be happy to hear statements like this could go until 2035. It's not going to be acceptable. So I actually want to echo Mr. Johnson's question to you about why infrastructure project delivery in the United States takes so long and costs so much in comparison with other wealthy countries that have equally strong labor and environmental standards as the United States. What are we going to do about it, and how can we apply those measures to this project, the Gateway project for New Jersey and New York? Thank you.
Well, thank you. First of all, let me share your enthusiasm for making sure that the Gateway project is a success. It holds the potential to ease congestion, to provide better service, to create stronger redundancy and availability for intercity rail and a whole number of other issues that will be very important for the Northeast Corridor and represent such an economically significant set of transportation activities that the entire country will benefit. And in particular, I want to applaud the agreement that was reached between New York and New Jersey, knowing that it's never a small or easy thing for two states to agree on cost sharing. And I called Governor Murphy and Governor Hochul to express my appreciation for their leadership on that. It is a project or a set of projects that will, I think, test us in terms of our ability to reduce the gap between the cost it takes to deliver a project in the US and the cost you see in a lot of other Western countries. While I can't point to any single factor that explains the difference, there are a number of things that we know contribute to it. Part of it is the complexity of aligning the different parties, and so that's why we're so pleased to see the states collaborating in this regard. Also, the Gateway Development Commission now has its executive director named. That's also, we think, a very positive development because it gives you the unified leadership that you need. We also want to inventory best practices from other countries or other parts of the U.S. that have been quicker than others while maintaining project quality. And we are driving ourselves very hard internally to try to make sure the process is as smooth and as straightforward as possible. We think that with the right level of intentionality, we can buck the trend of very large, very complex projects to go longer and cost more than they should.
Thank you so much. I yield back my time and will now go to Mr. Westerman for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg, for being here today. Count me among one of those members of Congress who didn't vote for the what I would call the world's largest infrastructure spending package in the history of the world, one that was more than enough money to completely rebuild the U.S. interstate highway system in today's dollars. But the big issue was that not only did it not come before this committee, it went before no committee and had no markup in the House of Representatives. But it is the law now, and as we look to do oversight on it, I noticed that last Friday, FHWA proposed a notice of proposed rulemaking to require state DOTs and metropolitan planning organizations to establish declining carbon dioxide targets and develop a system for measuring and reporting greenhouse gas emissions. This is kind of in line with the President's executive order in January of 2021. However, nobody voted on this in the IIJA because it wasn't in there. So in light of the Supreme Court's recent ruling on the EPA's authority over power plant emissions, do you have any concerns that the administration may be overstepping the law and putting this out? And plus, the amount of time, this is a big issue, and I've already had my state DOT contact me about not having enough time to comment on it.
We're very confident in the congressional authority for this rule. It actually dates back to 2012 when Congress passed MAP 21, which provides for the Federal Highway Administration to put out performance measures. We've used that authority, or I should say the department, because much of it's before my time. But the department has successfully used that authority on a number of different issues, and this is part of that tradition, and I think one that comes at a very important time. The clear, obviously the evidence on climate change and the destruction of American lives and property due to climate change is beyond any doubt. We also know that the largest sector in the U.S. economy contributing greenhouse emissions is the transportation sector. And we've been very mindful of the limits on federal authority in crafting this proposed rulemaking. It doesn't, for example, mandate any targets. It's really about the states being able to track their progress toward their own targets. But with this being such a central issue of importance for the world and for the American people, what would it say about us if we couldn't even measure it? And so we're trying to get those basic standards in place. And if your state DOT has any concerns in terms of their ability to comply, this is certainly the time to make those known through the NPRM comment process, but also we'd be happy to engage with them directly.
Thank you. And you talked about climate and carbon. It's something that I work on. I'll work on a lot of natural climate solutions. But you had mentioned earlier in the testimony, I know you have a goal, or you're bought into the goal of, I think, replacing half of the fleet by 2030 or half of the new car sales. And you just mentioned that transportation is the largest sector of climate emission or carbon emissions. So what % of the world's carbon emissions is the United States accountable for?
think at this point, we remain in the top two, if I recall correctly, and are in the neighborhood of 15%.
15%, and that transportation being the largest part of that, what percentage of that 15% does transportation?
Depending how you count, something like a third.
Okay, a third of 15%. I think the number is actually closer to 27%, but that's all of transportation. How much of the transportation are passenger cars responsible for?
I would say surface is the biggest share. I don't have the percentage offhand. I just know that it's something we're responsible for, and with every piece that we're responsible for, shame on us if we don't do the best that we can.
Yeah, and if you go through the math, you find out that if every electron going into an electric vehicle, if all passenger cars were electric vehicles, you're offsetting less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which that's nothing to laugh at, but it's just not the panacea that I see folks on the left claiming that it is, and it's a huge cost to our country. Do you think there's other areas maybe we should, with all the challenges with electric vehicles? And I heard you talk earlier about how we're developing the minerals and elements, the copper wire, the lithium. Well, you're saying that, and then I'm the ranking member on the Natural Resources Committee, and I see bill after bill to withdraw mining from federal lands where these resources lie. So if we're developing them here in this country, I sure don't know where we're developing them. It appears to me that we're relying more heavily on China and other countries to provide the minerals and elements that we need, and we're not developing here. So it looks like there's a miscommunication between the administration and what members of Congress are working towards, and it kind of in opposite directions. I yield back.
If you'd like to respond, it's okay.
I don't want to tie up any more time. Just to endorse the idea that there's going to be a lot of different things we've got to do at the same time. We simply think anything that we're responsible for, especially using technologies that exist and that American workers are making good money building right now, are those that show the most promise and those that we got to push the hardest on.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Allred for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman DeFazio for holding this hearing. Secretary Buttigieg, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming to Dallas and seeing some of the good things that we have going on there. I want to thank the department for getting the historic funding from this bill that I was proud to vote for out as quickly as you have. These dollars are making already a monumental impact on my community and communities across Texas. In fact, last month, the Texas Department of Transportation released its plan to build out an EV charging infrastructure throughout the state to support 1 million electric vehicles. Thanks to the IIJA, the state is expected to receive about $407 million over 5 years to do that. Now, as you know, you've been to Texas, it's a big state, we've got some big distances involved. I'm wondering how you propose working with state DOTs that are similar to Texas, they build a reliable network of stations that addresses range, anxiety that maybe some consumers have, and allow us to really make this a success.
Well, thank you. We recognize that for your community, communities across Texas and many in the U.S., the ability to successfully participate in the EV revolution, to get the fuel savings that come with owning an EV, are only as good as your opportunities to charge them. And especially if your work or your commute requires you to cover long distances on a regular basis, we've got to make sure that it is as certain that you'll find chargers where you need them as it is that you'll find gas stations where you need them on a road trip today. With the funding that Congress has provided, we have formula dollars going to every state. This year's slice of that, $615 million. To make sure that there is that backbone across the highway network. And I'll say this was crafted with a lot of regard for the differences between the states. We don't know what the right way is to lay it out in every particular, so we've asked the states to prepare their plans and then file them with us by August 1st. As long as they meet the legal requirements, then we'll be off and running on funding them, and look forward to seeing what Texas and the other states prepare for us.
Yeah, I think it's exciting. In a former life, I was an NFL player, and I was interested to see in the last Super Bowl, every car commercial was for an electric vehicle, right? I mean, this is what I think people are excited about. But for states like Texas, for us to move into that future, we need this charging infrastructure. And so I think it's it's an incredibly important aspect of this bill. I also want to talk about aviation. As you know, DFW is home to one of our busiest aviation sectors. We're home to the second busiest airport in the world, Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. In 2016, it received recognition as the first airport to become carbon neutral in North America. Recently, DFW received $35 million from FAA to increase terminal sustainability and assist the airport in reaching its net zero emissions goal by 2030. And I'm wondering how the department envisions airports using the Airport Improvement Program funds from IIJA to help build capacity at the airports, and if you believe these funds will help with some of the delays that I certainly have been hearing about and also experiencing as somebody who flies twice a week, most weeks, and cancellations that I think so many folks here in the country are feeling.
Thank you. Yes, we were very pleased to support DFW's application through the terminal program that's going to help them with the power plant, and I think yield not only air quality improvements and sustainability improvements, but also I think cost savings for the airport in the long run, which means whatever those fees do go to maybe are more likely to be passenger facing than if they were just going into the heating and cooling bill, which we certainly welcome. You mentioned the other program, the Airport Improvement Program, AIP, which is funded to the tune of $3.35 billion in the President's fiscal year 23 budget request. And those are dollars that we think will help enhance capacity as well as safety, security, and other concerns at the airports. And so that will be part of the stack alongside the other sets of aviation funding that came in the infrastructure law that can really help us on everything from physical plant improvements around the airport, the runway, the apron, the gates, to things like air traffic control facilities that if you allow them to deteriorate can also become a limiting factor, not to mention a quality of life issue for our very hardworking air traffic controllers. All of those call for investment. We're glad that we're able to deliver so much of it now thanks to the bipartisan law.
Absolutely. Well, I know I'm almost out of time here. I just want to say was happy to hear you say recently you plan to use the funds from IIJA to establish high-speed rail demonstration projects in the country, and if you could briefly elaborate on how the department plans to deliver on that goal and how much of the funding do you plan to allocate towards high-speed rail projects, just very briefly.
Sure. So in a nutshell, it's enough not to build out a full high-speed rail network across the U.S., but to begin to demonstrate that the U.S. can do high-speed rail as effectively as anyone. And we look forward to supporting as many routes as possible. It'll probably be a handful stacked alongside all the other rail needs in the U.S., but enough, I hope, to show that America can lead here as well.
Well, certainly one in Texas. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Nels for 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Part of the genius of the Founding Fathers was a system of checks and balances. Congress has a duty to oversee the executive branch, and members of Congress deserve answers to questions they pose to the executive branch. My office has written several letters to you, and we have not received a response on most of them. I sent you a letter back on May 2nd asking you a very simple question about whether the Biden administration supports maintaining a preferential no-fly zone for Disney. Did you ever receive that letter? Did you read it?
I believe we have it, yes.
Okay. Mind you, that no other amusement park enjoys restrictions on airspace, including competitors like Universal Studios. These no-fly zones are usually reserved for high-security targets like the White House and our most sensitive military facilities like nuclear launch sites. So it totally makes sense. I would like to add, no executive agency wrote to Congress about a national security need for this no-fly zone, which is the custom. The Obama administration's FAA administrator testified that Disney's no-fly zone does not meet the standard requirements and would not be in place had Congress not enacted specific legislation, a process that has been widely reported that was done out of uncouth lobbying. So what is the administration's stance on the preferential treatment for Disney's no-fly zone?
Well, of course, fundamentally, we simply have to apply the law. And in this case, as you noted, this set of flight restrictions that the FAA maintains, we do so because it's part of congressional legislation that was enacted in 2004. And then we codify those in notices to air emissions. I know that we have had inquiries both from members of Congress from time to time and from industry about this. Ultimately, any changes to that policy would be for Congress to put forward, just as the policy itself has come from congressional statute.
Fair enough, and thank you, and I will be pursuing just that here in the next Congress. And could you please, and just in one word, let's have some fun with this. Could you please describe America to me in one single word? What would that be if you could describe America in one single word?
Well, for me, I guess home.
Home. Fair enough, fair enough. Well, just a few weeks ago, this is how President Biden described America in one word. Could you please tell me what that word means? It's this one right here.
Mm-hmm.
Could you even say the word?
Congressman, I'm not in the habit of trying to read transcriptions.
I bring this up to you, sir. I bring this up to you
on television
because you yourself questioned Donald Trump's mental state of mind in September of 2019 when you stated to CNN, I quote, "If our presidency is not in good shape, then our country is not in good shape." And Mr. Secretary, I could not agree with you more. I'm going to repeat what your quote is. If our presidency is not in good shape, then our country is not in good shape. Inflation's at 9.1%. Gas prices are through the roof. Our adversaries are exploiting our weaknesses across the globe, and our southern border is non-existent. This administration puts the American people last. The left and the dishonest media, which in my humble opinion is the greatest threat to this country, the dishonest media, began questioning President Trump's mental state back in February of 2017, a month into his presidency. We now have President Biden in office for 18 months, and just recently, we now see the mainstream media questioning President Biden's mental state, and for good reason. Sadly, he shakes hands with ghosts and imaginary people. He falls off bicycles. Even at the White House Easter celebration, the Easter Bunny had to guide him back into his safe place. Cue cards that say, "sit here," or "end of speech," which he actually states, that is, if he stays awake. So my question for you is, sir, have you spoken with any other cabinet members about implementing the 25th Amendment on President Biden?
First of all, I'm glad to have a president who can ride a bicycle. And
That's your
I
question.
will look beyond the insulting nature of that question and make clear to you that the President of
Have
the United
you
States...
spoken to
Of
any other
course not.
cabinet members about implementing the 25th Amendment on President Biden?
Of course not.
Please allow the
You ought to
witness to
know
finish his answer.
Have you
that the
emailed,
President of
this
the
is my
United
time,
States-
have you emailed any members
President of
with
the
the
United
executive
States.
branch about the president's health or
President
cognitive
of the
decline,
United States
including
is
text
as
messages
vigorous a
from your
colleague
private
or
phone?
boss as I have
I
ever had the
figured this.
pleasure of working with.
What about political appointees at USDOT? Have you spoken about this
Gentleman's
issue
time
with
has
them?
expired.
I couldn't hear the question, I'm sorry.
Well,
Will you yield me
Matt-
1 minute, sir?
absolutely not. If you had yielded the secretary some time to actually answer the ridiculous question, you might have actually gotten something. We will now
question?
turn to Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Mr. Van Drew? Mr.
Thank
Van
you,
Drew would like to yield
Mr.
me.
Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for convening this hearing. And of course, thanks to Secretary Buttigieg for joining us today. The IIJA was an important bill that funds our policy needs. As the chairman reminded us last week, as his portrait was being unveiled, the House passed a truly game-changing, transformative bill that we call the INVEST Act, establishing greenhouse gas emissions metrics, advancing a fix-it-first agenda, and massive investments in environmental justice initiatives, to name a few. Even though we weren't able to advance the INVEST Act or the Build Back Better Act, I am heartened that under your leadership, Mr. Secretary, the USDOT has begun to implement parts of this progressive agenda under its existing authorities. Still, more must be done, and how we implement the IIJA is absolutely critical. For far too long, transportation policy has been disconnected from the broader social justice debate. Yet it determines access to jobs, clean air, clean water, affordable housing, and the fate of our climate. Mr. Secretary, I represent a working class immigrant community in Chicago, and in the Cook County suburbs. And as you know, Chicago is a hub for rail, air, and truck transportation. Our communities deal with both the good and the bad of that. My neighborhood, Little Village, has some of the highest asthma and respiratory diseases in the country. And unfortunately, pollution from our transit corridors plays a big role in that. We have to be honest about the policies that led us here and deliberate about setting a new path. Mr. Secretary, approximately how much of IIJA money is going to expand highways and add lanes?
So I'd have to pull the exact funding, and of course, some of that will depend on how the states and project sponsors choose to allocate funding that can go either toward transit or highways in the formula case, and on the discretionary side could go toward projects that are more or less highway intensive. But what I'll say also is that this legislation gives us the means to look beyond the 1950s, 60s, or 70s mentality about transportation that often really subjected any mode other than single occupancy vehicles to the back burner. And when we do, as you wisely note, the benefit is not only in terms of more convenient, equitable, and decent ways to get around, but also the physical health of people who aren't subjected to as many emissions when we have more thoughtful and more wide-ranging options for people to get around, including active transportation and excellent public transit.
Excellent point. Mr. Secretary, the GHG performance measure is a great step, but what else is DOT doing to help ensure that the IIJA is part of the solution to emissions and climate change?
Well, certainly I would point to the Carbon Reduction Program, which provides dedicated funding for the purpose of making transportation investments that reduce the carbon intensity of the U.S. transportation sector. But that's far from the only set of resources that are going to make a big difference. Again, pretty much any investment that you make in transit is likely to reduce carbon emissions, but it's that much more so on investments like the low and no emission bus program, which helps local jurisdictions and transit authorities to acquire clean, efficient, electric or otherwise low emission buses for their routes, saving taxpayer money in the long run when they do so. We've got $7.5 billion for building out the electric charging infrastructure across the country, including, importantly, $2.5 billion, which is allowing us to make community charging investments, knowing that there are some places, often low-income places, where fuel savings might mean the most to a family if they could access an EV, but where it might not yet be profitable to install one. And so we think we can buy down that difference and stimulate access to EVs in multifamily dwellings, for example, in dense neighborhoods, just as we're building out that network across the U.S. on the longer stretches of highway. So just about every corner of our infrastructure policy holds the promise of helping us combat the climate challenge, and we're committed to making sure that we do everything that the law provides for us to do in that regard.
Absolutely. As you know, the transportation sector is one of the most unionized sectors in the country. Can you speak to how USDOT is going to put those principles into practice?
Yes, we know that it's vitally important to do so, and I think that what we really need to make sure of is to engage all of the players who have an opportunity to participate in the workforce of the future, because this is not just a question of fairness, although that's reason enough to ensure that we're bringing in people from backgrounds that have been excluded from these labor opportunities in the past, and supporting high-paying, good jobs with the opportunity to join a union. But it's also simply going to be necessary in order for us to get the work done, because this will require more of the American people in the American workforce than perhaps any national undertaking since World War II.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and Mr. Chair, you're back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Van Dyne for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you being here today, Secretary Buttigieg. It's good to see you again, and I'm always going to call you Mayor, just because that's how I know you. I appreciate you coming to the DFW airport, and I'm glad that you were able to meet with my colleague from Texas. DFW airport's smack dab in the middle of my district. I'm a former board member, so next time you come in town, more than 24 hours notice would really be appreciated, so that I can make sure that I'm actually there. Interesting comment about the EVs earlier from my colleague from New Jersey. the quote was made that as more people buy EVs, the price of gas goes down. Correct me if I'm mistaken, but we've got more people driving EVs now than we ever have in our history, and I haven't seen anything but gas prices go up. Part of the concern is that as we continue to see the incentives for EVs, they seem to be getting a free ride on our highways, even though because of their weight, considerable weight over gas guzzling, to use that quote, other vehicles, that they're no doubt causing more damage to the roads. So are you concerned that the weight of the EVs and their lack of paying for the roads that they're driving on? I mean, my chief concern is, okay, if less people are paying gas taxes because we're giving that pass to EVs, they're causing more of the damage. We're not going to have the maintenance on that.
So I think there's two sides of the coin to think about. On one hand, as you point out, EVs don't pay, if it's a fully electric vehicle, you're not paying the gas tax, which is traditionally how we've funded the Highway Trust Fund. On the other hand, we know that ultimately there will be less expense to Medicaid, for example, for fewer children suffering from asthma that's a consequence of living near areas that have a lot of traffic with traditional combustion vehicles. We know that there are very real dollars and cents costs to allowing climate change to continue to accelerate.
So I'm
And so we need
concerned
to
right now.
balance those
Yeah, I'm
two.
concerned right now on paying for our infrastructure bill, this massive infrastructure bill that we just passed. And you just took away the pay for if you're incentivizing them to drive EVs. We have no pay now, and they're causing considerable amount of damage on the roads.
Right, so a couple things here. One, as you know, the IIJA sought to use not increased user fees, but other sources of funding in order to make those investments possible. But two, this legislation, following in line with previous transportation bills, created pilots for states to look at alternatives for how they want to fund their roads for those that rely on gas taxes, as many states do. And we recognize different states are going to come up with different approaches here. We think we'll learn a lot from them. I think it's relatively early in that process, but we're interested to see the
Yeah,
data.
the problem with it being early in the process is we've already passed the bill. We just don't have any way of paying for it. So while we can set up these test projects in other states, the fact is that we're already going to have that debt and we've got no pay for it.
Well, it's not that we have no pay for it. It's just that we don't have we will have less revenue from electric vehicles into the particular pay for that has been favored by Congress in the past.
So we're going to have to find it somewhere else in the budget.
Right, so typically it's been general fund, and that's one way to do it, but far from the only way.
Yeah. In many instances, you are empowered and directed by Congress to ensure that federal laws protect transportation workers, passengers, and the movement of goods. Consistent federal standards help to protect interstate commerce and prevent a state or circuit court from making decisions that would impact the entire country or from creating conflicting standards around the country, which would make compliance confusing, impossible, or unnecessarily costly. Are you concerned about the challenges to the department's federal authority that would create a patchwork of state regulations? And specifically, I'm talking about what's happening in California.
So there's always a balance that we know it has to be struck principally between Congress and the courts and the states on what ought to be a federal power and what ought to be a state power. We think that often things seem to go best when the federal standard amounts to a floor, not a ceiling. And then some states who want to make sure that there's even more done for the well-being of their workers or for health or whatever the particular thing is that they regulate.
I'm sorry, my time is rapidly going down, but do you know how many DOT registered motor carriers have only one truck?
No, I don't.
So it's about 300,000. So as we continue to see crisis after crisis with our supply chain, what would happen to our supply chain, the country, and these small business owners if the U.S. were to ban their ability to work as independent contractors for large motor carriers?
We'd certainly need to find a way for them to be able to work effectively, if not in traditional models, then in new ones. But again, that's something that's being resolved between the courts and the state right now. We're not a party to that litigation.
So you don't think that the DOT has any play in what's happening to basically cut our supply chain countrywide?
Well, of course, we have a lot of play in what's happening to our supply chain.
But you're
That's
waiting
why
for
I
the
work
courts
on it
to
all the
figure it
time.
out?
We're just not party to the litigation.
No, but are you planning on getting involved at all, or are you just waiting for the courts to decide?
Oh, we're working on dozens of things related to truck driver availability, but in this particular regard, we're not a party to the litigation.
Okay.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. 5 minutes. Mr. Auchincloss, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary, welcome back. We appreciate your engagement in this in this hearing. And for me, as somebody who's worked in the future of mobility in the private sector, in the public sector, and academia, it's just so heartening to have a Secretary of the Transportation Department, a former mayor who took on parking minimums and who understands that we need to move our infrastructure away from car-centric planning and development and towards a future of human-centric infrastructure and walkability. After the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, I held one-on-one meetings with leaders of every city and town in my district to hear about their infrastructure priorities. There are a lot, but one overarching one is expanding commuter rail access. And in Newton, Massachusetts, the commuter rail there, the 3 stations that comprise it, is not currently fully ADA accessible. As your department prepares to issue your NOFO for the All Stations Accessibility Program, can you discuss both the timeline for applications as well as the criteria that you'll use beyond local, state, federal alignment?
Well, thank you. The All Stations Accessibility Program is going to provide unprecedented dedicated resources to help upgrade legacy rail stations for people with disabilities. And it's worth noting that a great many legacy rail stations that were built before 1990 and the ADA are not accessible. In fact, about 25%, so that's 927 stations across 17 systems, remain inaccessible. It's one of the reasons why we understand the sense of urgency about putting these dollars to work. This year's slice of the program, based on the funding Congress provided, will be about $350 million, and we're close to being able to put out the notice of funding opportunity. Matter of fact, I think by the end of the month, we'll be able to do that. It's a new program every time, and we have over 40 new programs. Of course, it takes a little more time to bring together than new iterations of the programs that have been there all along. But I still believe we'll be able to make award announcements by later on this year. And the NOFO will have more information about how we're going to prioritize, but I expect we'll get a lot of applications because we know the need is very great.
Well, Secretary, I'd welcome you in the district to come tour the Newton Commuter Rail Station and see the opportunities inherent in improving it. I'd like to also ask you about microtransit. This technology has helped transform communities by providing affordable and flexible transit solutions, often by ensuring critical connections to pre-existing transit hubs and filling so-called transit deserts in underserved urban and rural areas. And earlier this year, 14 of my colleagues and I sent you a letter urging you to provide flexibility in the IIJA programs for the inclusion of on-demand transit. I'd appreciate hearing your thoughts on how the department's going to support and encourage the use of microtransit across the country as you implement the IIJA.
So we've seen how beneficial and how filled with potential microtransit is. I think it's also safe to say it just wasn't what folks had in mind when most of our U.S. transportation policy and legislation was set up. So part of what we're trying to do is find ways to flex funding within existing programs to make clear when we're confident that the law will allow for it, that jurisdictions can do this. A good example is CMAQ, the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Funding, has a lot of flex eligibilities. But working with federal highways, we think we can do that in a number of existing programs like the Highway Safety Improvement Program, and work it into some of the new ones we're bringing online, like the Safe Streets for All program. We've seen successful micro-mobility programs all over the country, including, I would note, not just in cities where I think people easily imagine scooters or e-bikes being used, but also in rural areas from Alabama to Delaware. And we also have some FTA research and demonstration funds that in certain circumstances can be used to help here. And I think this really is part of the answer for the long run on how that first or last mile works for people interacting with the transit system going forward. So we want to do everything we can to be flexible and supportive here.
That's terrific. And I would also add that in addition to micromobility, on-demand transit as well to fill those transit deserts is critical. I want to give you, Secretary, the last 30 seconds just to talk about airline staffing. I know you're frustrated. My constituents are frustrated. I'm frustrated about the cancellations. You've been on top of it. Can you explain what you're working on this summer?
Thank you. We were especially concerned after the Memorial Day travel weekend and disruptions that happened here. And it's clear that while we welcome the fact that demand has returned, passengers are going back on those vacations that they had put off, either because of financial or direct COVID concerns or both, we're seeing now that the airlines aren't prepared to meet that demand in many cases. I'll say we've seen a number of steps since those conversations that I had with airline leadership that I think are very positive. We've seen increased pay, including a lot of regional carriers, which have struggled most to hold on to pilots. We've seen more attention going into customer service and staffing customer service. And on the FAA side, we're working on anything we can do to make sure that air traffic control resources are allocated in ways that are helpful too.
Secretary,
there's a long way to
I'm
go.
over time, so I have to cut you off there. Maybe another member wants to give you some time more to talk about airline staffing, but I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize Mr. Rouser for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Secretary. Great to see you. It's good to have you here in person in the committee. In fact, I think this might be one of the first committee hearings we've had where the witnesses have been here live, or the witnesses here live. So thank you for being here. I'll get right to the point, but I'll preface it with this. You know, we all understand that you need to have rules for the road, but you don't necessarily need a stoplight every 10 feet. And that's kind of sums up my philosophy as it relates to regulatory structure. And to that end, note that according to the Council of Environmental Quality, the average time for an EIS, or Environmental Impact Statement, under the NEPA process was more than 7 years for FAA and the Federal Highway Administration projects before the Trump administration streamlined NEPA in 2020. But of course, as you know, this administration has reversed those efforts as it relates to NEPA. And so I'm just curious, how do we reconcile the immediate need for big infrastructure projects with the administration's efforts to prolong and really delay important projects? You know, time is money, and there are a number of us that feel like those NEPA reforms were very much needed and very helpful had they been allowed to be implemented fully rather than being reversed.
We think we can deliver projects promptly and swiftly without throwing environmental or other concerns out the window, and we're committed to finding ways to make sure that the process goes as smoothly as possible. The bipartisan infrastructure law provides a lot of the terms for doing that, including starting a short clock on a process that we met, I think, within 60 days. On categorical exclusions, as well as things that are going to be more long-term in terms of measures to make the process easier to navigate or make it simpler in some way. I do want to point out that on our transportation, certainly our federal highway programs, 98% of them fall under a categorical exclusion, which means we can usually turn that around in about a month. But there are those longer EIS and EA processes where as you say, time is money, and it's very important while meeting the requirements of the law and making sure that the processes have been followed, that there's no unnecessary delay or redundancy. And I think, again, the infrastructure law sets us up for that by calling for that 2-year median or average. We're working to make sure we're on track for that. And other measures that I think will help too.
Well, all that sounds good, but I don't really think in practicality that's truly the case. But for time's sake, I need to move on to a couple other things. With regard to the short line freight rail industry, a couple things as it relates to this. Obviously, you're familiar with the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Grant Program. The infrastructure bill added some more resources for that. Can you comment on the department's commitment towards using that particular program to invest in key safety goals, like allowing short line freight rail to upgrade and make important repairs? And then quick follow-up to that, do you agree the program helps short line railroads improve the efficiency of the supply chain?
Thanks for the question. I think short line railroads are more important than ever, as we've seen in the context of the renewed attention to the supply chain. So we need to make sure that we're supporting them. Around the time we rolled out the CRISI grants for this year, I had the pleasure of visiting one in Michigan, and we know there are similar ones across the country. So when it comes to the CRISI program, which our last round was $368 million, and we'll have that much more funding thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law. We certainly see that this is going to be a very important source of support for all railroads, certainly to include short lines.
Yeah, given that's the case, I'm a little bit perplexed, though, that the department is moving forward with a new crew staffing rule that could require railroads to hire more personnel or operate with more people on a train than is necessary. Now, if that goes forward over time, it could force hundreds of small business short-line freight railroads to make artificial and inefficient economic and management decisions instead of putting those resources into capital improvements to track, for example, structures that are critical for the efficient movement of goods and services. Why is USDOT considering forcing these small businesses to hire workers they don't need, when in fact, quite frankly, it's hard to find a worker anyway?
Well, the reason for the rule is safety, and I don't want to preempt what's coming. I think any day now, actually, in terms of NPRM, that'll have more of the specifics. But the intention here is to make sure that we continue to meet our fundamental obligation as a department to ensure that that we have safety for workers and anybody who comes into contact with our rail system, while being as straightforward and as reasonable as possible for the benefit of a goods movement fluidity.
Well, again, that sounds good, but I don't necessarily think, in fact, I know that's not necessary. They ought to be allowed to invest their resources in areas where it's going to create more efficiency and allow for us to overcome these supply chain challenges. Madam Chair, my time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize Ms. Bordeaux. Ms. Bordeaux, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member, for holding today's hearing, and thank you, Secretary Buttigieg, for being here today. Mr. Secretary, I want to start by thanking you for visiting Georgia's 7th Congressional District last summer. It was a pleasure to have you and show you all the innovative work going on at Peachtree Corners around autonomous vehicles and electric charging, and please know that you are always welcome back. Last year, members of this committee and our colleagues in the Senate came together to pass the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a historic and bipartisan once-in-a-generation investment in our nation's physical infrastructure. Like many of my colleagues here today, I was proud to support this legislation, and I'm grateful for the administration's partnership in getting the money out the door to our partners on the ground. There's a lot to talk about here, but just to focus on a couple issues that are really important to Georgia's 7th Congressional District. One is microtransit and the other is electric vehicles. I know that you have already answered some of my questions about microtransit when some other my colleagues asked them earlier. I just want to reiterate, it's very, very important. My district is a suburban community. It's been hard to get consensus around bus rapid transit and other forms of transit. And so microtransit is very, very helpful, particularly for our cities, which form these important hubs all over the district. And I hear from people all the time about how much they really appreciate the microtransit we've been able to get in and how much more they would like to see of that particular innovation in our community. Talking about electric vehicles, I'm very proud of the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, and glad to see that the state of Georgia received nearly $20 million in fiscal year 22 as a part of $135 million over 5 years to support efforts to expand EV charging across the state. So just touching on that for a few minutes, could you talk a little bit about whether there have been hurdles getting the new National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program off the ground? And then also how the administration has prioritized consumer experience to ensure it is easy, consistent, and mirrors their current experience at the pump.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for the great visit we had to Georgia and some very impressive things we saw, both in terms of policy and in terms of technology on the ground. As your question hints, there's tons of opportunity, but a lot of challenge in getting it right with this electric vehicle infrastructure, especially because we've not had something like this at scale in the U.S. It's very different from the infrastructure for fueling gas cars, and we need to be mindful of that as we go. One thing we're thinking about in particular with regard to the consumer experience is making sure that these charging stations are interoperable and are available. You can imagine if you're taking a road trip and every third or fourth gas pump didn't work, or if you had to be a member of a particular gas station chain in order to even use the pump, that would not be a positive or efficient experience. But in some places and in some cases in the past, that's what some EV drivers have faced. And so we need to make sure that we're not only getting the dots in the right places on the maps, but paying attention to the quality as well as the quantity of these EV charging stations, especially those that would be supported with taxpayer funds. So those are some of the things that are on our mind as we work in close collaboration with my colleagues at the Department of Energy through these issues. And I have to say, it is, in my view, a remarkably positive example of interagency cooperation to see how the Department of Energy has teamed up with the DOT to work through these issues, some where we have more expertise, some where they have more expertise, put our heads together and get a good plan going to meet the president's goals.
Okay. And just to follow up on that, we recently had a company, Siemens, that rolled out some innovative new electric charging infrastructure that can be easily deployed to gas stations or convenience stores. But the challenge is the grid and the ability to plug into the grid so we can get the basic technology on the ground. What is going on with that? How are you all thinking about integrating the overhaul of the grid that's required in order to support electric vehicle charging?
Well, there's no way we're going to be able to run tomorrow's cars on yesterday's grid. And it's one of the reasons why we're thankful for the ways that the infrastructure law contemplates and supports upgrades for America's electrical infrastructure. And here, I'll yield to the Department of Energy, which has more of the day-to-day expertise on this work. But again, we're integrating it with our work on the EV side through that joint office. And we know that's vitally important because we need to have the the backbone of electric infrastructure to support the electric charging infrastructure that we're funding.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. I recognize Ms. Steele for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Graves. Once again, California, a state that has 40% of nation's imported goods and 30% of the nation's exported goods moving through just 2 of its ports, Los Angeles and Long Beach. It's implementing AB 5, a law that will worsen the nation's supply chain crisis by abandoning the independent contractor model used by the trucking industry. Mr. Secretary, as AB 5 would impact 70,000 truckers alone just in California, what is your department doing to lessen the impact of this bill on our national economy?
Well, the availability of trucking workers is a critically important part of the supply chain challenge. It's one of the reasons why we've been working on this from day one, taking measures both to help recruit new truck drivers and to support the kind of job quality improvements that we believe will help us to retain more truck drivers in the career. Our Bureau of Transportation Statistics estimates that some 300,000 people leave the profession on a yearly basis, and we've taken steps that we think have successfully helped to move the needle on some of those systemic challenges. So we're going to continue those efforts. They're all in line with the President's Trucking Action Plan, and we'll continue doing that as we wait for more information and guidance from the state of California about state policies.
But this, shortage of drivers is part of it, but not just the shortage of drivers, but in California, these independent truckers cannot really come in. So you are co-chair of Supply Chain Task Force. And I know that you developed the Trucking Action Plan, but I've been seeing you and other members of administration encourage the ILWU, International Longshore and Warehouse Union, and PMA, Pacific Maritime Association, to come to the table to keep freight flowing through LA and Long Beach. Why aren't you doing the same for independent truckers? Because as of now, that we have so much shortage of truckers, and these independent truckers can come in. I think that's going to reduce our supply chain crisis much more. So why shouldn't they get the same type of exemptions that gig workers and entertainers get who are in emphasis for the law?
Well, again, to the extent that this is a state law, we respect the role of the state of California. We're in touch with them, and we know that they have indicated that the California Labor Agency is working with those who need assistance coming into compliance, and that they are looking at the supply chain factors too. This is one piece of a very big puzzle, and we are doing everything we can on the pieces that are up to us federally, while respecting the areas in which we are not formally part of the process.
So you're not really working with Governor Newsom just visited last week here, and you never had a meeting with him. That you know what, he could want to actually declare the state of emergency, bypass AB5. So you know it's gonna actually loosen up a little more of the supply chain crisis. So you never really did that. And what that California Trucking Association sued that Supreme Court refused to hear, that what that's going to be really impacting for this supply chain crisis.
So again, we're not part of the lawsuit that you referred to, or we're not a party to it, and it doesn't have a federal procedural role in that sense. We are obviously continuing to monitor anything and everything that can affect throughput in our ports or in any part of the goods movement system in the U.S. And we will work with any party that has ideas or has needs in order to make sure that goods keep moving as they need to.
Just my last question is, so you have a communication open between governor's office, California governor's office, and your department to solve this problem?
So we will respect the role of the state, but always be prepared to engage on anything we can do to be supportive or helpful toward the goal of making sure there's good throughput.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. I recognize Mr. DeSanyoye for 5 minutes.
Thank
are
you,
recognized.
Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate that. Mr. Secretary, it's delightful to see you. Thank you for your really extraordinary work on this. We always sort of miss, I think some of my colleagues have mentioned, the historic nature of this and how difficult it's been for both Republican and Democratic administrations to get this bill. I want to specifically talk to you as somebody who served 3 different governors on the California Air Resources Board and served on the California Transportation Commission and has put a lot of time in the last 25 years in alternative fuels and our renewable portfolio standard. And I was also the author of some of the conversation in the legislature of our VMT bill with the full expectation that that's where we would recover our funding. California has 42% of the EV and fuel cell market in the United States, but we have the chicken and egg problem with infrastructure. So I want to talk to you about that. I was very, very happy that a bill that's a priority for mine was incorporated into the infrastructure bill, the Clean Corridors bill, to provide this infrastructure. We have a proportionate amount of infrastructure, but putting it in the right place to make it effective. And we can see this in the private sector. And Madam Chair, I'd like to submit for the record an article for Forbes magazine. It's entitled "Every Automaker's EV Plans Through 2035 and Beyond," if I could.
It's been received.
Thank you. Let me just read, this is from Forbes magazine. So for my colleagues who wonder where the marketplace is going and respects the marketplace is clearly going away from internal combustion engines. There's a place for it, there's a transition, but this isn't pie in the sky. As somebody who's been involved with this and realizes the frustration with battery technology, we are also just on the cusp of exponential change on affordability and range and durability on battery electric. So the beginning sentence of this article in Forbes magazine is, and I quote, "There's no longer any doubt that the auto industry is going electric." So to your point about Brandeis and states being the laboratories of discovery, I understand that different states are going to have different pathways. We are, as you I'm sure know, in places like the Bay Area, early adapters. The car companies tell me that. That's why we're moving to this. Not better or worse, it's just the marketplace. So how do we get this infrastructure in a thoughtful way out to make it work? The Chinese are adding 4,000 EV stations a day. They're adding over 100,000 EV and fuel cell stations a month. We have a little over 100,000 in the United States. So the private sector is going in and trying to fill this out. But when I talk to the private sector, both the the car manufacturers and the energy manufacturers. We in California have our renewable portfolio standard. So it's now going to 50% by 2030. So from well to wheel, getting that energy clean and efficient. And then the point I think we miss here is the importance of our economy to transition to this energy source and to do it efficiently. So how do we do that in the significant investment in this bill that you've been such a leader on, and do it but in a thoughtful way? Those 12 states that represent over 60% of GDP and the vehicle market in the United States that follows CARB's leadership under the California waiver, the Clean Air Act. How do we strategically do this?
So I agree that the one thing is certain, which is this is where industry is headed and this is where the world is headed. I think while that one thing is certain, at least three important things are not. Will it happen quickly enough to meet our climate challenge? Will it happen in a way that America leads? And will it happen in a way that's equitable for everyone? And those are the considerations that guide our involvement with things like the federal support for charging stations. If we get it right, what we'll be doing is accelerating it so that it helps us meet our climate goals. Presenting an American alternative to that Chinese model that you mentioned is gathering steam there. And reach people who might otherwise be left out of the transition, at least in its early stages, knowing some of the upfront costs that are involved, knowing that charging infrastructure isn't often available in lower income areas, even though provided they could afford to purchase or use an EV, it's low income drivers who would benefit the most from the fuel savings that come with having one. So those are the principles that guide the way that we're framing both the $5 billion in formula funds that the states will execute according to their plans, and then the $2.5 billion for discretionary work that we'll do to effectively fill in the gaps in communities. And we think taken together, we have the tools that will allow us to then stimulate that much more private sector involvement too, which can help make sure we actually do this as quickly as the economy and the climate need us to.
Thank you. Exciting. I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I recognize Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you here today. I want to quote some of the things you said in your comments at the very end. Together, we have the opportunity to improve countless lives, support good-paying jobs, strengthen America's manufacturers, modernize our infrastructure for decades to come, and cement America's position as the world's leading economy. All good goals, and we recognize the administration's aim at reducing GHGs and coming down to as many renewables as possible. From Texas, Gulf Coast to Texas, we produce about 65% of the nation's jet fuel through my 6 ports that I represent, more than any other member of Congress. So energy for us is a big deal. Texas is the #1 wind energy state in the country, and I think you might have even alluded to it or somebody else did. We are #2 in solar panels right behind California, but we're working on that. We'll get there. We'll get there. So I appreciate you being here and bringing this all up. I want to bring a couple of projects to your attention that are called Seaport Oil Terminals. What they do is they move product through a pipeline, pardon me, out off the shore. It could be 20 miles, 15, 20, 30 miles. And so what happens then, pardon me, is they move the product cleaner. We're going to use oil and natural gas for a long while. You're seeing what's happening overseas. You got to know the Europeans would rather buy from us than from Russia. What I tell people is that fossil fuels, not the enemy. Greenhouse gases emissions are. And we're able to produce it probably cleaner than most other countries in the world. So we have a chance to move this product offshore. We move it faster so it gets to the very large crude containers offshore. Right now, the other countries in the world are building huge ships and they can't come up our canals, our channels into our ports. So what has to happen is they take smaller ships called lightering, you've probably heard the term, and they're having to go back and forth numbers of times while this huge container sits out there, diesel engines idling most of the time. And then you're gonna have small ships that are having to make 3 or 4 trips, again, diesel engines idling. So we can move it faster, less greenhouse gas emissions. We can move it safer. There's no bunch of 18-wheelers on the road. There's no 18-wheeler crashes. There's no tank cars overturning. I think you actually talked to Mr. Graves about his district with some wreck in his district. And you have to know that our allies across the world would like this. It helps us with our imbalance of trade. We actually get to refine product and sell it and move it around the world. With decades to come, you know, we're gonna have a lot of natural gas, clean natural gas, and you know this, a lot of these ships are converting to LNG. So we want this ability. All that to say that a couple of these businesses have been in contact with your chief of staff. I believe it's Laura Schiller. And is she with you today?
She's not here today, but she is our chief of staff.
She had good enough sense to stay away from this place, didn't she? And then I think your general counsel, John Putnam, is he with you today?
Not at the hearing, I don't think.
Okay, very good.
Keep him pretty busy back at headquarters.
Well, all of that said, we talked about the permitting process earlier on with some of our colleagues up here, and we'd like to move that as quickly as we can because time is of the essence, and we want to make sure that we can reduce that permitting process time down to the least amount. Everybody wants a clean environment. You probably don't know this about the Gulf Coast of Texas, but we've got a lot of hunters and fishermen and stuff like that. We want good, clean, pristine lands to do all of those things to pass on to our kids. So what I'd like to do is to give you, this is actually a report on what we call SPOT, the Seaport Oil Terminal project in the national interest, because we can produce it cleaner, faster, helps us with our imbalance of trade, and actually does a good job for the economy while protecting the environment. And then see if I could follow back up with you in the coming days to see if you can kind of get me an update on where both of these projects are. And any questions for you? We got 23 seconds.
No, I'd be happy to do that. We've got, I know a lot of permits or license requests in with the Maritime Administration, and I'd be happy to find out where these two sit among those, and certainly appreciate the complexity of the transition you're describing.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here, and I'll get this over to you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I recognize Mr. Moulton for 5 minutes. You're recognized, Mr. Moulton.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, good to see you. Thank you very much for being here. The IIJA appropriated more money for investing in rail than ever before in our nation's history. Now, President Biden vowed to, quote, make sure that America has the cleanest, safest, and fastest rail system in the world. Will this indeed be the administration's legacy? How will you fulfill the administration's promise, the president's promise?
Well, thank you. We are enthusiastic about the opportunities here for passenger rail. As you know, in any other administration, I might count myself the biggest enthusiast, but I'll only ever be second place in this administration in terms of readiness and commitment to seeing America have the highest quality rail. As you mentioned, we've got unprecedented resources to work with here, the most since the inception of Amtrak itself. A lot of that is candidly dealing with backlog, dealing with the underinvestment that has happened in the past, but also opportunities for new high-speed rail in the U.S. And we think that seeing is believing. The sooner people can see successful high-speed rail deployed on American soil,
I've made this case for a long time. I completely agree with you. In the May appropriations hearing on the DOT budget, you said that through the IIJA, you hope to establish high-speed rail, quote, in at least 2 or 3 geographies. Have you identified those corridors yet?
So I can tell you that FRA has been in dialogue with a number of project sponsors or involved in some way in a number of high-speed projects. Certainly, of course, California, which has been discussed here, the Brightline West vision, Dallas to Houston, those have all been on FRA's desk in some way or another. But of course, we're still early in the life of the deployment of the federal-state partnership dollars and other resources that could make a difference here, and I don't want to prejudice any upcoming applications.
Well, I understand, but we're not early in the administration's timeline here. These projects take some time, and I just want to emphasize that if this is going to be President Biden's legacy, if President Biden is going to be known as the father of developing rail in the United States, not the old-fashioned rail that we have, but high-speed rail that is truly the envy of the world and that a lot of Americans actually want to ride, then we've got to get cracking on identifying those corridors. Yesterday, dozens and dozens of flights were canceled on the Northeast Corridor, mine among them, because of a strange and unusual phenomenon called thunderstorms. The rest of the world would be able to get from Washington to Boston in 3 hours on a train every 20 minutes, with never a delay for weather. Not only are we not there, but we're moving in the wrong direction. In 2010, Amtrak proposed reducing travel times in the Northeast Corridor to 1 hour and 36 minutes from Washington to New York and 1 hour and 24 minutes from New York to Boston. Yet 7 years later, in 2017, trip time goals went up from 136 to 210 and from 124 to 245, almost 3 hours. Just a year later, they increased again to 229 and 308. So we're not only behind China and the rest of the world, but we're going in the wrong direction. I mean, at this rate, the goals Amtrak sets 10 years from now will be worse than how long it takes to travel that roller coaster ride on the Northeast Corridor today. So to meet the president's promise of the fastest trains in the world, we need a transformative investment, not just repairing an old line that is too slow by definition, by the way it was laid out in the 1830s, but actually building a new railway, the same way that we didn't just repair Route 1, we built 95. So how will you make that happen with the discretionary funds in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act?
So what I would say is with the dollars that we have for the Northeast Corridor, first there are some needs that need to be met in terms of safety and reliability for the long run. But where you really begin to start gaining minutes comes in a couple of ways. One is improving certain areas where there's, just because of the condition of the track, a need to slow down. But the other, to your point, where you see the most possibility for gain is actual realignment. That obviously brings a lot of complexity with it, but to meet the more aggressive and ambitious goals, we need to take the dollars as far as they will go in that direction. And I know that's what Amtrak's working on right now.
Well, let's make sure that we don't throw good money after bad. I mean, I think that's the key point here. If we're going to fulfill the president's promise of the fastest trains in the world, then they're not going to run on an old-fashioned Northeast Corridor. We can't just spread funds out to every state in the union. We've got to pick a couple of high-speed rail projects that will succeed, and so that Americans can see the value of high-speed rail, whether you live in California or the Northeast, or in Texas, or in the Southeast. You know, the most popular high-speed rail corridor in the world is about the same distance as Atlanta to Chicago. Think about all the cities in between Chicago and Atlanta that you could serve with 250-mile-per-hour service. It would be transformative for this country. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
The gentleman's time has expired. I recognize Ms. Malotakis. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. I want to talk about this administration and New York City's latest scheme when it comes to the war on cars. This is a pure cash grab, and it is the congestion pricing plan that was passed by the New York State Legislature and signed by our governor and supported by the mayor. But I'm certainly opposed, and I think that this is simply, to try to impose a $35 fee, potentially, to connect, to drive within your own city. It's just completely outrageous, and it adds to why New York is such a high-tax state, not only dealing with the high gas prices, the highest probably among, one of the highest in the nation, but high tolls. We have the skyrocketing costs of used cars. Everything has gone up, right, in terms of if you want to be a driver. And people need to drive to get to where they have to go, particularly in cash-starved communities. In New York City, we also have speed cameras. You name it, we have it, if it's going to collect cash, unfortunately. But this is what I seem to believe is another cash grab by our city and our state. It is going to be the first in the nation. Okay, and with that, I understand that also the Federal Highway Administration has responsibility to oversee an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. I believe, being that it is going to be the first of the nation, we have a responsibility to do our due diligence, and we should be conducting an environmental impact statement versus a simple assessment. Can you please talk a little bit more about, will you be requiring the MTA and New York City to be conducting a full and thorough EIS, as well as it should be an economic impact study as well?
Well, our responsibility is to make sure that a project that comes forward with local sponsorship and interest, like the congestion pricing project, meets all federal legal requirements, including under NEPA. I can't say here whether, based on just sitting here, all of the things that go into the determination of whether it's the EA track or the full EIS. But what I can say is that our department will bring its best judgment to making sure that, that it goes through the appropriate process. And our role is to make sure that all of those federal hurdles are responsibly met, but recognizing and respecting that ultimately this is a local policy choice.
Yes, but first of all, there is bipartisan opposition among legislators and members of Congress from the New York, New Jersey area, as it will have a significant impact on our constituents who are already struggling to get by and make ends meet. Now, with earlier this year, the MTA chief executive, Jenna Lieber, said in an interview that the FHA told her that they were going to fast track the environmental process. Can you make a commitment that you will require an environmental impact study, a full and thorough review, being that this is the first in the nation program that is, I don't want my constituents to be guinea pigs. We need to do this right. I believe that we shouldn't be doing it at all. But if you're going to do it, at least do the due diligence in making sure that we are, dotting our I's, crossing our T's, and seeing what the actual impact will be on businesses, on the surrounding community, on the residents that live in the central district, but also the other residents of the city from the outer boroughs that have to commute in.
I can commit to you that the review will be proper and thorough. No unnecessary delays, but no cut corners either.
Will you do an environmental impact study, though, a complete study, not just an assessment? That's really the question.
The legal determination about whether it falls into an EA or an EIS is not one that I want to make sitting here. But I can tell you that the review, either way, will be proper and thorough on our part.
Well, if it's going to be proper and thorough, then that would be the EIS. I think that anyone looking at this as an observer. But let's move on to the public comments. How are you going to make sure that the public knows that this process is fair, that it's transparent, and it's not coming at a predisposed arrival at a determination already?
Well, again, our role here is procedural. It has to do with making sure that the process has been met, not preempting a local decision about what the right policy is. I know there are strong views on all sides that cut across party lines and even across state and regional lines when it comes to this project in particular. But we recognize that the state and local role is distinct from the federal role. Ours is to make sure there's transparency and thoroughness.
Okay. Lastly, the Federal Highway Authority Administration required MTA to answer 430 technical questions after they submitted their draft of the EA. These have not been made public or made available to Congress. Can you share those questions and answers that you received with the public?
I'll look into the right process for getting those out.
All right, well, if we believe in transparency, we want to make sure we get that information out to the public domain. So I'd appreciate your assistance with that. And my time has run out. Thank you.
Thanks.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. I recognize Mr. Fitzpatrick. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Buttigieg, thanks for being here. Good to see you. I want to start by thanking you for your collaboration on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. There's a lot of work, a lot of collaboration. You worked great with our office, and I wanted to thank you for your role. I think it's going to really help America. 2 questions. One, I don't think it's a fair question because we just sent this letter last week, but I wanted to bring it to your attention to you and FRA Administrator Bowes regarding the public nuisance and safety risks posed by blocked railroad crossings. Certainly, I've had to deal with it in my district. I'm sure I'm not alone, for sure. Lasting upwards of an hour, these instances keep communities like mine and others across the country cut off from commercial, government, and even more significantly, emergency services, ambulances, fire trucks, and whatnot. So I'm going to submit this to the record. We've sent it to you, but I know how agencies work. It might not have made its way to you. Just to give a general update on the block crossing portal authorized by the IAJA, Section 22404, and to address mechanisms or formulas that could measure the real impact on obstructions at railroad crossings. Madam Chair, do I have permission to submit this for the record?
Accepted.
So my question, Mr. Secretary, I want to discuss secondary cockpit barriers. The 9/11 Commission did tremendous work many years ago. Most, if not all of those recommendations were adopted by Congress and implemented as part of our commitment to say never again to allow terrorists to infiltrate a cockpit and treat a commercial airliner like a guided missile. And even though this was included as a requirement for new aircraft in the last FAA reauthorization nearly 4 years ago, application of this mandate has been very slow and very inconsistent. I can tell you myself and my problem solver co-chair have been working very hard, and we've had frustrating results across multiple administrations, to be frank, and we're hoping that we can finally fix this. Since coming to Congress, we've advocated for this, both of us, and on 9/11, my constituent, Captain Victor Saraceni, he was the pilot of Flight 175 that our whole world watched in horror crash into the second tower. And I was just wondering, Mr. Secretary, if you're, how familiar you are with this, how much you're tracking it amongst a lot of the things you're dealing with. If you'd be willing to work with us as well to get this done. This is a bipartisan issue. It's really incredible that, decades after 9/11, the most basic safety precaution is not being implemented. And it's been blocked for all the wrong reasons by special interests that don't want it for the wrong reasons. And all of us have flown. We've watched, the exchange when the cockpit door opens for a pilot to go to the restroom or whatnot. And all that's placed there in our current policy is a food cart and an airline attendant. And 20 years after 9/11, it's really unacceptable. And it's such an easy fix. It's something that's already been approved and authorized on new aircraft. Will you be willing to work with us on getting that done and also getting retrofit for current aircraft? And do you have any other comments on the issue?
Thank you. Yes, I'm following this policy. I know there's a great deal of impatience, which I share, about making sure that this is delivered, especially knowing that it's called for in legislation. I've met with advocates as well as experts on this, and it's being taken very seriously. The FAA is working toward getting that rulemaking advanced. Certainly welcome a chance to work with you to make sure that some of the complexities are handled in the right way, and that there's transparency around the timeline.
Thank you, sir. And just like all these tragic incidents, whether they be school shootings or acts of terrorism, when we say never again, it's got to mean never again. And that 9/11 Commission did tremendous work, and this is one of the few, if possibly the only one, of the committee's recommendations that has not been implemented. And I fear that, given how many years have passed since the last terror attack, due to to the credit of a lot of our national security agencies have avoided that, that we're still vulnerable, because human instinct is to drop your guard when you've kept your guard up for so long. And I'm fearful that this is an instance where we're exposed to a terror attack once again. And I hope that you're willing to work with us, which you say you are, and I appreciate that. But if you could just flag this for your people, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, you're back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes. You're recognized, Mr. Stauber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thanks for coming today. You are aware of transportation issues, and do you know what the most inland port in North America is, or correction, in the United States is?
I'm guessing it's in Minnesota.
Do you know where?
The most inland measured from the coasts or from the Great
Most
Lakes?
inland port is the port of Duluth Superior.
Duluth, right.
And I'm very proud to represent that. A lot of commodities and economic value come to and from. And I also appreciate your support for the SULOCs. That money's got to continue because that helps the Midwest. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the chip shortage. As you know, we want to reshore it. And I think that when you reshore it, you also have to reshore the minerals. You're aware, or maybe I'm going to make you aware, that the biggest copper nickel find in North America is in northeastern Minnesota, which we call the Iron Range. The Iron Range has mined 80%, the iron ore that makes 80% of this America's steel. So if we have Buy America provisions, we have to have the Iron Range full steam ahead. Would you agree with that?
I don't want to weigh in outside of my lane in terms of production, but I certainly agree that we need to make sure we're onshoring or nearshoring raw materials that are going into the
And we
products.
have to keep our iron industry front and center. That's a strategic national security. So when you talk about the chips, you know that a Ford F-150 gasoline has 300 chips, and then the EV has 3,000. When you take critical minerals offline, you allow foreign adversarial countries to mine that. And I'm just going to give you an example, cobalt. The vast majority of cobalt is mined in the Congo using child foreign slave labor. I think you would agree you'd rather mine those minerals in the United States under the best environmental and best labor standards. Would that be correct, Mr. Secretary?
Yes, if we have a choice in where to source any of these, we would certainly prefer that it be in the U.S.
Yeah. Your administration just took 234,000 acres of opportunity to mine critical minerals. And let me tell you about the Duluth complex. It has 95% of our nickel reserve, 88% of our cobalt, over 1/3 of our copper, and other platinum group metals. And your administration won't even allow an EIS on a project-specific review. And you were just talking about an EIS, and you know, Mr. Secretary, the EIS is the highest look from the federal government. They wouldn't even allow a project-specific review of an EIS on a mining project. So when you want to transition, and when we transition to electric vehicles, why don't we have an administration that supports mining in the United States? And by the way, there was a project labor agreement in that. All union labor from northern Minnesota. Hundreds of jobs and secondary jobs. And so I would just, I would submit to you that we need to mine in the United States. So we hold a destiny in the palm of our own hands. And the administration doesn't seem to understand that. And I would ask you this, and I think I know the answer. You do not support slave labor, is that correct?
Of course.
Okay. This administration doesn't understand. We can remove ourselves from child slave labor by mining in the United States and making sure our allies get these critical minerals from countries like the United States. Amnesty International, nonpartisan, has said we have to stop allowing slave labor, child slave labor. And I would submit to you, we are able, ready, and willing, Mr. Secretary, to mine these critical minerals. We have to have an administration that has the political will to do it. And it doesn't. In October of 2020, then candidate Joe Biden said to the American people, we are going to mine these minerals domestically. That was a breath of fresh air for northern Minnesota and the Iron Range. Now, President Biden says we're going to source those minerals from foreign nations. That, Mr. Secretary, is unacceptable. That's what we talk about. We can onshore and use American labor with the best environmental standards and labor standards in the world. And I would ask you to go back to your administration, specifically the President of the United States, and allow us to mine these minerals here in the United States. And I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize Mr. Van Drew. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Oh, your mic, sir.
Thanks again for being here. Now you can hear me. See, if you didn't say anything, we would have cut him a break. He could have missed the whole thing. In my district of South Jersey, the infrastructure law is aiding the United States Army Corps of Engineers with a major dredging project in New Jersey's intracoastal waterway. The project will clear out the clogged maritime channels of the entire Jersey shore and make my community safer and more prosperous. The law has also provided funding for airports and roads and projects across my district. South Jersey has many infrastructure needs, but I will continue to advocate for this infrastructure law as it is implemented over the next 5 years. I supported this bipartisan infrastructure law because it included conservative regulatory policies negotiated by Republicans, including one federal decision. One federal decision cuts through red tape by requiring interagency cooperation, limited paperwork, and fixed permitting deadlines. This policy saves years of time and millions of dollars in the permitting of infrastructure projects. With inflation ravaging, the country is in critical situation that we need to reduce red tape so that the funding increases and the infrastructure law is not outpaced. That's why Republican negotiators, including these conservative regulatory policies. My concern is that this administration is far more focused on spending money than on saving money, and that irresponsible mentality could irresponsible mentality could hinder the implementation of the infrastructure law. One federal decision policy was put in place by President Trump in 2017 through executive order. President Biden repealed it on his very first day in office. Thanks to the infrastructure bill, one federal decision is now law, and it must be implemented. So first question, Mr. Secretary, do you fully commit that you are proactively working to implement one federal decision in line with the letter of the law?
Yes, we are. I thank you, first of all, for your support for this legislation and want you to know that we take very seriously the one federal decision provisions. Some of those that we've been working on this regard include establishing schedules that are consistent with the 2-year average for most EIS, or environmental impact statements, issuing necessary authorizations, all necessary authorizations within 90 days of completing NEPA, setting up a performance accountability system to track progress toward our goals, and reporting to this committee regularly on the timelines of both the EISs and then the environmental assessments and categorical exclusions, as well as working with other agencies on how to make sure that those categorical exclusions are as efficiently managed as possible. So we'll continue our work on this, and through the permitting dashboard, aim to be as transparent as possible about how we're actually tracking toward those goals.
We would appreciate that, and that can make a huge difference. Thank you. Second question I have, and Congressman Stauber touched on it a little bit, concerned about the batteries. I'm concerned about the environmental aspects of the batteries. And I'm concerned about that so much of it is controlled by China, so much is controlled in the Congo. It is virtual slave labor. We say as Americans that we are humane and we're human and we care about life, yet we buy so many products from a country that absolutely has no concern about that at all. I don't understand how we do that. I don't understand how we buy products made by the Uyghurs. I don't understand how we are going to be buying products from the Congo, but the Chinese controls the Congo. And what scares me about that, Mr. Secretary, is they control too much already. They are getting stronger, and I'm sorry to say it, we are getting weaker. And you know, he may not have been one of your favorite presidents, but he was one of my favorite presidents, Ronald Reagan. He said, there is no country that has ever been attacked because it's too strong. We have to get stronger. We have to produce our own goods and services. We have to produce our own cobalt if we're going to do this. We have to produce our own elements and minerals. And finally, we have to make sure if we make standards for ourselves internally that we keep those standards for everybody else. You know what's happening now, and you do know this. China is creating tons of fossil fuel. Russia is. India is. Other countries are. They're not following the Paris Accords in most of Europe. We're doing it and putting ourselves at a deficiency and diminishing ourselves and making ourselves weaker. That is unacceptable. That's not the America I know. It's not the America I believe in, and we have to stop it, Mr. Secretary. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. That concludes our hearing. I would like to thank Secretary Buttigieg for your testimony today. Your comments have been very informative and helpful. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time that our witness has provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to him in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by members or the witness to be included in the record of today's hearing.